In the vast ocean of psychology and spirituality, Carl Jung stands as a beacon that illuminates the deepest mysteries of the human mind. The Secret of the Golden Flower, a fascinating and enigmatic work, invites us to explore the intersection between ancient knowledge and modern psychology. Drawing from Taoist texts and his own interpretation of archetypes, Jung reveals a path towards self-understanding and personal transformation. The golden flower, a symbol of enlightenment and wholeness, becomes the central metaphor of this inner journey, where the alchemy of the mind meets the quest for transcendence. As we unravel Jung's teachings, we face fundamental questions. What does it truly mean to attain wisdom? How can we integrate our shadows and light to become whole beings? In a world where superficiality often reigns, the secret of the golden flower challenges us to look inward and confront our hidden truths. With each page, Jung leads us to an astonishing revelation. True knowledge is not found outside but within the secret garden of our own psyche. Are you ready to discover the golden flower that blooms within you? Why is it difficult for Europeans to understand the East? As a man who fully experiences in a Western way, I can only deeply feel the foreignness of this Chinese text. To some extent, knowledge of Eastern religions and philosophies helps my intellect and intuition grasp these things, allowing me to conceive the paradoxes of primitive religious conceptions. Technologically, or through the comparative history of religions, it is a Western modality to veil one's own heart under the guise of so-called scientific understanding. On one hand, this happens because of the narrow-mindedness of this approach, rejecting signs of living sympathy. On the other, apprehension that involves the spirit's feelings might lead to experiences that should be taken seriously. Scientific objectivity would reserve this text for the philological insight of sinologists, safeguarding it from any other interpretation. However, Richard Wilhelm took a deeper look at the mysterious and subterranean vitality of it, preventing such a pearl of the highest and most penetrating vision from being lost in the drawer of specialized science. It is a special honor and joy for me that his choice of a psychological commentator has fallen precisely on me. Nevertheless, this selected piece of knowledge, which rises above any specialization, faces the real danger of falling into another specialized drawer. Anyone who diminishes the merits of Western science would be cutting off the very branch upon which the European spirit sits. Science is not a perfect tool, but it is an invaluable and superior instrument that only becomes harmful when it pretends to be an end in itself. Science must serve, and it errs when it usurps a throne. It must serve all other sciences, since each needs, due to its insufficiency, the support of the others. Science is the tool of the Western spirit, and can open more doors than bare hands. It is part of our understanding but obscures insight when it takes the conception it allows for the whole conception. However, it is precisely the East that teaches us a different, broader, deeper, and higher conception, one that comes through living. This latter is still only faintly known to us, like a naked feeling, almost ghostly, of the mode of religious expression, which is why Eastern knowledge is often placed in quotes and dismissed into the murky realm of beliefs and superstitions. However, this completely misunderstands Eastern objectivity, which does not consist of exaggerated, sickly sentimentality of inhabitants of an otherworldly, unbalanced state, but of practical, penetrating conceptions, the flower of Chinese intelligence, which we have no reason to underestimate. That assertion may seem bold and provoke some head-shaking, which is forgivable due to the extraordinary lack of knowledge on the matter. Moreover, it is entirely conceivable that our confusion over when and where the Chinese world of thought could be united with our own is glaringly apparent. The common error, for example, of the theosophical Westerner lies in turning away from science with contempt, superficially grasping the ecstasy of the East, undertaking yoga practices to the letter, and thus abandoning his only secure ground, the Western spirit, while getting lost in a fog of words and concepts that never originated in European brains, and to which they can never be grafted to any advantage. An ancient adept once said, "If the wrong person uses the right means work wrongly." That proverb of Chinese wisdom is, unfortunately, all too true and starkly contrasts with our belief in the right method, regardless of the person employing it. In truth, everything in these matters depends on the individual, and little to nothing on the method. The method is certainly just the path and direction one takes, whereby one's actions are the true expression of their being. If this is not the case, the method is nothing more than an affectation, something artificially learned, an addition without roots or sap, serving the illegitimate aim of self-deception, a means of deluding oneself and escaping the possibly merciless law of one's own being. This has nothing to do with the deep-rootedness and fidelity to self of Chinese thought. On the contrary, it is a renunciation of the self, a betrayal of oneself to foreign and impure gods, a cowardly maneuver to usurp spiritual superiority. All this is profoundly opposed to the essence of the Chinese method, whose penetrating conceptions have arisen from the fullest, most authentic and truest living within that ancient Chinese cultural life, which grew coherently and logically from the deepest instincts. This life is, for us, distant and inimitable. Western imitation is tragic because it is a non-psychological misunderstanding, as sterile as the modern escapes to New Mexico, the beatific islands of the South Seas, or Central Africa, where people seriously play at being primitive so that the cultured Western man can secretly evade his pressing tasks. It is not about avoiding or inorganic evangelizing of the foreign, but about rebuilding Western culture, which suffers from 1,000 ailments. This must be done in the right place and must be addressed by the European man with his Western triviality, his marital problems, his neuroses, his illusory social and political ideas, and his complete disorientation in considering the world. It would be better to confess that, at its core, we do not understand the esoteric and hidden depths of a text like this. Even if we do not wish to understand it, we should at least suspect that this inner approach, which allows us to look so deeply inward, might only be possible because these people have so fully satisfied the instinctual demands of their nature that little or nothing prevents them from perceiving the invisible essence of the world. It may well be that this inward gaze requires liberation from the appetites, ambitions and passions that bind us to the visible world. This liberation likely results not from premature repression of instincts born of fear, but from a meaningful and full satisfaction of instinctual demands. If so, the gaze toward the spiritual may become free. When the law of the land is observed, anyone familiar with the history of Chinese morality, and who has also carefully studied the I Ching, that ancient book of wisdom that has penetrated Chinese thought for thousands of years, will not dismiss these doubts lightly. They will also know that the opinions in our text are, from a Chinese perspective, nothing unheard of but simply inevitable psychological consequences for our characteristic culture of the Christian spirit. What was positive and worthy of effort in the quest was, for most of the time, simply the spirit and the passion of the spirit. It was only in the twilight of the Middle Ages, during the course of the 19th century, that as the spirit began to degenerate into intellect, a reaction arose against the unbearable dominance of intellectualism, which first committed the understandable, though forgivable mistake of confusing intellect with spirit, and blaming the latter for the offenses of the former. Indeed, the intellect is harmful to the soul when it dares to take possession of the heritage of the spirit, for which it is in no way suited. The spirit is something higher than the intellect, as it not only encompasses it but also includes emotional states. It is a direction and principle of life that aspires to luminous, superhuman heights. Opposed to this, however, is the dark, earthly feminine, yin, with its instinctive emotionality, reaching downward into the depths of time and the roots of bodily continuity. These concepts are undoubtedly purely intuitive, but they cannot be dismissed when attempting to understand the essence of the human soul. The Chinese could not do without them, as their philosophy shows they have not strayed as far from the central facts of the soul as to have lost them through the exaggeration and overestimation of a single psychic function. Thus, they never cease to recognize the paradox and polarity of life. Opposites always balance each other, a sign of high culture, while unilateralism, though it lends impetus, is a sign of barbarism. I cannot see the reaction that has arisen in the West against intellect in favor of eros or intuition as anything other than a sign of cultural progress, an expansion of consciousness beyond the overly narrow confines of a tyrannical intellect. In no way do I wish to diminish the immense differentiation of the Western intellect, by which the Eastern intellect could be described as childish. This, of course, has nothing to do with intelligence. If we could elevate another or even a third psychic function to the same dignity granted to the intellect, the West would have every reason to expect to surpass the East. That is why it is so regrettable that Europeans abandon themselves and imitate the East, when they have so many possibilities to remain themselves and develop from their own mode and essence, just as, over millennia, the East has produced its own celestial light. In general, and from the incurably external position of the intellect, it may seem that what the East values so highly holds no appeal for us. Certainly the mere intellect cannot immediately comprehend what practical importance Eastern ideas could have for us, which is why it classifies them only as philosophical or technological curiosities. The misunderstanding runs so deep that even learned sinologists fail to grasp the practical application of the I Ching, and have thus regarded this book as a collection of abstruse magical incantations. Modern psychology offers a possibility for understanding. I have gained practical experience that has revealed a completely new and unexpected access to Eastern wisdom. It should be understood that I did not begin with some insufficient knowledge of Chinese philosophy. On the contrary, when I started my career as a psychiatrist and psychotherapist, I knew nothing about it. It was only through my later medical experiences that I realized I had been unconsciously guided along that secret path that the greatest minds of the East have explored for thousands of years. This might be taken as subjective imagination, which is why I hesitated until now to publish anything about it. But Wilhelm, the excellent connoisseur of the Chinese soul, has frankly confirmed this coincidence, giving me the courage to write about a Chinese text, and in its entirety, it belongs to the mysterious darkness of the Eastern spirit. However, what is extraordinarily important is that its content is at the same time a living parallel to what occurs during the psychological development of my patients, none of whom are Chinese. To make this strange fact comprehensible to the reader, it should be mentioned that just as the human body has a general anatomy that transcends all racial differences, the psyche also has a general substratum that transcends all cultural and conscious differences. This is what I have termed the collective unconscious. This unconscious psyche, common to all humanity, consists not merely of contents capable of becoming conscious, but of latent predispositions toward identical reactions. The fact of the collective unconscious is simply the psychic expression of the identity that transcends all racial differences in the structure of the brain. This is the basis for explaining the analogy, even identity of mythical themes and symbols, and the possibility of human understanding in general. The various lines of psychic development stem from a common basic stock whose roots extend into the past, which also includes a psychic parallel with animals. In purely psychological terms, this is a matter of common instincts for representation, imagination, and action. All conscious representation and action have developed from these unconscious prototypes and remain connected to them, especially when consciousness has not yet reached a high degree of clarity, that is, when it depends more on instinctual drives than on conscious will, more on emotion than rational judgment. This state guarantees a primitive psychic health, which becomes maladaptive as soon as circumstances arise that demand greater moral effort. Instincts are only sufficient for a nature that remains identical to itself in integrity and magnitude. The individual who depends more on the unconscious than on conscious choice inclines toward a manifest psychic conservatism. This is why primitive peoples do not change over thousands of years and fear anything foreign or novel, which could lead them to maladaptation and therefore to the gravest of psychic dangers, namely a kind of neurosis. Higher and broader consciousness, which only arises from the assimilation of the foreign, tends toward autonomy and rebellion against the old gods, who are nothing more than the powerful unconscious primordial images that until then had kept consciousness dependent. The stronger and more independent consciousness becomes, and thus the more autonomous the conscious will, the more the unconscious is pushed into the background, and the more likely it is that conscious formation will emancipate itself from the unconscious prototype. By gaining freedom, it will break the chains of mere instinct and eventually reach a state of instinctlessness or opposition to instinct. That uprooted consciousness, which can no longer refer to the authority of primordial images, is indeed a Promethean freedom, but one without God. It hovers over things, even over men, but therein lies the danger that it will turn around, not for each individual but collectively, for the weakest members of such a society, who will then be Prometheanly chained to the Caucasus. The wise Chinese would say, using the words of the I Ching, that when Yang has reached its maximum strength, the dark power of yin will arise within it. For at noon, the night begins, and yang breaks and transforms into yin. The physician is in a position to observe such a reversal in literal translation to life. For example, a successful businessman, solely dedicated to his work, who achieved everything he desired without concern for death or yin, at the peak of his success, retires from his activity and in the shortest time falls into a neurosis that turns him into a weeping old woman, chains him to his bed, and thus, so to speak, destroys him. In this, we see the transformation of the masculine into the feminine. We find an exact parallel to this in the legend of Nebuchadnezzar in the Book of Daniel and in general in the madness of the Caesars. Similar cases of extreme one-sided expansion of the conscious viewpoint and the corresponding yin reaction of the unconscious make up a significant element in the practice of nervous system specialists in our time, a period of overvaluation of the conscious will. Where there is a will, there is a way. Let it be clear, I do not wish to disparage the high moral value of conscious will in any way. Consciousness and will may, without harm, remain preserved as the highest cultural achievements of humanity. But what use is morality that destroys people? Reconciling will and power seems to me to be more probable as a sign of barbarism. More often, wisdom seems preferable. Perhaps these are the lenses of the physician through which I view things differently. Certainly they must repair the damage left in the wake of exaggerated cultural achievement. Be that as it may, it remains a fact that the necessary one-sidedness distances consciousness from the primordial images so far that collapse follows. And long before catastrophe strikes, signs of error appear. Loss of instincts, nervousness, disorientation, entanglement in impossible situations and problems, etc. Medical examination reveals first and foremost an unconscious in full rebellion against conscious values, and consequently, impossible to be assimilated by consciousness. The reverse is out of the question. One is faced with a seemingly incurable conflict, with which no human reason can deal except through equivocal solutions or suspicious compromises. Anyone who rejects both sides is confronted with the question, where then is the unity so urgently demanded of the personality, and they are forced to search for it. This is where the path begins, the one that has been followed in the East since time immemorial. Evidently, the fact that the Chinese were never able to separate the opposites of nature so much that they lost sight of each other, even to the point of unconsciousness, played a role in this. Their consciousness had to maintain an omnipresent awareness that the opposites remained in their original proximity, as befits the primitive spiritual state. Nonetheless, they could not help but feel the collision of opposites, and consequently explored the path that could lead to what the Hindus call nirvana, meaning freedom from opposites. This is the path our text is about, and it is the same path followed by some of my patients. There could hardly be a greater error than to set the Westerner directly on the practices of Chinese yoga. By doing so, it would still remain a matter of his will and consciousness. Thus, consciousness would merely be fortified anew against the unconscious, and the very effect one seeks to avoid would be achieved. The result would be nothing more than an increase in neurosis. It cannot be emphasized enough that we are not Orientals, and therefore we start from a completely different base in these matters. Likewise, it would be wrong to assume that this is the path for every neurotic or for every phase of neurotic problems. This path concerns, first and foremost, those cases in which consciousness has reached an abnormal level and is, consequently, inappropriately detached from the unconscious. Such a state of consciousness is the conditio sine qua non. Nothing would be more mistaken than to embark on this path with neurotics whose illness results from an undue dominance of the unconscious. For the same reason, this path of development makes little sense before the midpoint of life, typically between 35 and 40 years old, and can even be exceedingly harmful, as has already been indicated. What fundamentally led me to take a new path was the feeling that the patient's core problem was unsolvable unless one violated one side of their being or the other. I constantly worked with the firm belief that, deep down, no problem is truly insoluble. Experience has confirmed this for me so far, as I have often seen one man simply transcend a problem that completely shipwrecked another. This transcendence, as I previously called it, showed itself through broader experience as an increase in the level of consciousness. Some higher, wider interest entered the field of vision, and with such an expansion of the horizon, the unsolvable problem lost its urgency. It was not logically solved in itself, but it faded in comparison to a new, stronger direction in life. It was not repressed or made unconscious, but it merely appeared in a different light, thus becoming something different. What, at a deeper level, had caused the most turbulent conflicts, even a storm of emotions, now seemed from a higher level of personality, like a passing storm viewed from the peak of a high mountain. The storm is not stripped of its reality, but one is no longer in it. One is above it. But since, from a psychological perspective, we are both valley and mountain at once, it seems an improbable illusion to feel beyond the human. Indeed, one feels emotion. Indeed, one is moved and tormented. But simultaneously, there is a perceptible state of transcendent consciousness, a state of awareness that prevents one from being identical with the emotion, a state of consciousness that can say, "I know I am suffering." What our text says about laziness, that conscious laziness and unconscious laziness are separated by 1,000 miles, applies just as fully to emotion. What happened here and there, where one transcended oneself from obscure possibilities, led me to violent experiences. I had learned to recognize inwardly that the greatest and most important problems in life are, at their core, all insoluble. They must be, for they express the necessary polarity inherent in any self-regulating system. They can never truly be solved, but only transcended. I therefore asked myself whether this possibility of surpassing oneself, that is, of further psychic development, was not in general what is normally given, and consequently, whether illness might arise from being stuck in or fixated on a conflict. Every man should truly possess, at least as a seed, this higher level and be able to develop that possibility under favorable circumstances. When I observed the developmental paths of those who silently, almost unconsciously surpassed themselves, and whose destinies had something in common, I noticed that the new approached them either from outside or inside, emerging from the dark field of possibilities. They accepted it, and with that acceptance they grew in stature. It seemed typical to me that one person would take this newness from the outside and another from within, or rather, it would grow in one from the outside and in another from within. However, the new never came from solely outside or solely inside. If it came from outside, it became an intimate inner experience. If it came from inside, it manifested as an external event. Nor was it ever consciously produced or willed, but rather it arrived as a natural flow over time. The temptation for me to turn everything into a goal or method is so great that I deliberately express myself very abstractly to avoid prejudging anything. The new must not be this or that, for otherwise it becomes a formula that can be mechanically replicated, turning into the correct means in the hands of the wrong person. What has impressed me most deeply is that the new which fate has in store rarely, if ever, aligns with conscious expectations. Even more remarkable, it often contradicts our ingrained instincts as we know them, and yet it remains an extraordinarily precise expression of the total personality, one that could not be more complete. What did these men do to achieve such redemptive progress? As far as I can see, they did nothing. They allowed things to happen. As Master Lu Tzu notes, the light circulates according to its own law. If one does not abandon their habitual vocation, letting things happen, doing in the act of not doing, this letting go served as a key for me, unlocking the door to the path. One must be able to let things happen psychically. For us, this is a true art, one not understood by most people as their consciousness constantly interferes, helping, correcting, denying, and in every way disturbing the simple existence of the psychic process. The task then is quite simple. If only simplicity weren't the most difficult thing of all, it consists solely in first observing objectively a fragment of fantasy in its development. Nothing could be simpler than this, but here is where the difficulties arise. Apparently, there is no fragment of fantasy, or it seems too foolish. There are thousands of good reasons against it. One cannot concentrate on it. It's boring. What could come of it? It's only, etc. Consciousness formulates countless objections. In fact, it appears eager to extinguish the spontaneous activity of fantasy, even though there is a higher intention and firm resolve to let the psychic process happen without interference. Sometimes it even becomes a formal spasm of consciousness. If one overcomes the initial difficulty, criticism immediately arises, attempting to interpret, classify, aestheticize, or devalue the piece of fantasy. The temptation to interfere is nearly irresistible. After a faithful observation, one can relax the reins of the mind's impatience and even must do so. Otherwise, obstructive resistances arise. But with every observation, the activity of consciousness must again step aside. The results of these efforts are initially, in most cases, discouraging. Typically, the fantasies are confused plots that reveal no clear origin or direction. Each individual's path to obtaining fantasies is also different. Some find it easiest to write them, others visualize them, and still others draw them. For those gripped by a high degree of conscious spasm, sometimes only the hands can fantasize, modeling or drawing forms that are often completely foreign to consciousness. These exercises must continue until the conscious spasm disappears, or, in other words, until one can let things happen, which is the most immediate goal of the exercise. A new attitude is created, one that accepts the irrational and inconceivable simply because it is what is happening. Such an attitude would be poison for those already overwhelmed by what is merely happening. However, it is of the highest value for those who have consistently chosen, by exclusively conscious judgment, only what aligns with their consciousness, and have thus gradually drifted into a backwater of life. At this point, the paths for the previously mentioned types apparently diverge. Both have learned to accept what comes to them, as Master Lu Tzu teaches. When occupations come to us, we must accept them. When things come to us, we must discern them to the core. One will now mainly accept what comes from outside, while the other will accept what comes from within. And as the law of life dictates, one will take from outside what they would never have previously accepted from outside, and the other will take from inside what they had constantly excluded until then. This reversal of being signifies an enlargement, elevation, and enrichment of the personality. When previous values, as long as they are not mere illusions, are firmly maintained during the reversal, the person grows. If not maintained, the person falls to the other side, shifting from ability to inability, from adaptation to maladaptation, from meaning to meaninglessness, and even from reason to spiritual disturbance. The path is not without dangers. All good things come at a price, and the development of the personality is among the most costly. It involves saying yes to oneself, setting oneself as the most serious of tasks, and remaining continually conscious of what one is doing, keeping all its doubtful aspects always in view. A task indeed that cuts to the bone. The Chinese can refer to the authority of their entire culture if they embark on this long path. They do what is recognized as the best they can do, but the Westerner, assuming they truly want to take this path, faces all authority against them, intellectually, morally, and religiously. That's why it is infinitely easier to imitate the Chinese way and leave the skeptical European behind, or to seek a return to European medievalism and the Christian Church, rebuilding the European wall that separates true Christian men from the poor pagans and ethnographic curiosities that inhabit their surroundings. Here the aesthetic or intellectual flirtation with life and destiny abruptly ends. The step into higher consciousness leads beyond all supports and securities. The individual must give themselves fully, for only through their wholeness can they advance, and only their wholeness can guarantee that their path will not turn into an absurd adventure. Whether one's fate comes from outside or inside, the experiences and events of the path remain the same. Therefore, I need not elaborate on the varied external and internal events, whose endless diversity I could never fully exhaust. Nor would it be important in relation to our text for commentary. There is much to say, however, about the emotional states that accompany further development. These emotional states are symbolically expressed in our text, and indeed, in symbols that have been well known to me for many years through my practice, fundamental concepts. One of the enormous difficulties presented by translating this text, and others like it, is that the Chinese author always starts from the core, that is, from what we might call the summit, goal, or deepest and ultimate penetration. As a result, this is something so exalted that a person with a critical intellect might feel they are speaking with ridiculous arrogance or pure nonsense if they dared to intellectualize about the subtlest emotional experiences of the greatest Eastern minds. For example, Our text begins, "What is by itself is called Tao," and the Wuzhen Pian starts with the words, "Essence and life are the most refined secret of Tao." It is characteristic of the Western mind that it has absolutely no concept of Tao. The Chinese symbol for Tao is made up of the sign for head and the sign for to go. Wilhelm translates Tao as meaning, others as way, providence, and even the Jesuits as God. This shows the difficulty. Head could indicate consciousness, and to go implies leaving the way behind. According to this, the idea would be to go consciously, or conscious way. It aligns with the fact that Tao is sometimes used synonymously with the light of heaven, which as the heart of heaven dwells between the eyes. Essence and life are contained in the light of heaven and are, according to Lu Tzu, the most important secrets of Tao. Now, light is the symbolic equivalent of consciousness, and the nature of consciousness is expressed by analogy with light. The Wuzhen Pian is introduced by these verses. If you want to perfect without exclusion the diamond body, you must expressly heat the root of consciousness. You must illuminate the earth. Constantly reflect on the nearby law. Always let your true self reside hidden. These verses contain a kind of alchemical instruction, a method or path for the generation of the diamond body, which is also hinted at in our text. For this, a heating or elevation of consciousness is needed so that the dwelling place of spiritual essence can be illuminated. However, not only consciousness, but also life must be elevated. The union of the two produces conscious life. According to the Wuzhen Pian, the ancient sages knew how to suppress the separation between consciousness and life because they cultivated both. In this way, the skeleton and the immortal body fuse, and thus the great cut is accomplished. When we conceive Tao as method or conscious way that must unite the separated, we may have come very close to the psychological essence of the concept. It cannot be understood as a separation of consciousness and life, but rather, as I mentioned earlier, as the deviation or uprooting of consciousness. It also involves the task of consciousifying the opposites, of a reversal, a new unification with the unconscious laws of life. The goal of that unification is the attainment of conscious life, expressed in Chinese terms as the production of Tao, the circular movement and center. The union of opposites on a higher level is, as already highlighted, not a rational matter, and neither is it something of the will. Rather, it is a psychic development process expressed in symbols. Historically, this has always been represented by symbols, and even today it manifests in the individual development of personality through symbolic figures. This fact became clear to me through the following experiences. The spontaneous fantasies we spoke about earlier deepen and gradually concentrate into abstract images that apparently represent true Gnostic principles. When fantasies are expressed primarily as thoughts, intuitive formulations of obscurely perceived laws or principles emerge, which are immediately dramatized or personified. We will discuss this more later. If fantasies are drawn, symbols arise that mostly belong to the type called mandala. Mandala means circle, particularly a magical circle. Not only are mandalas widespread throughout the East, but they are also abundantly attested among us, especially during the Middle Ages. Christians of the early Middle Ages often placed Christ in the center, with the four evangelists or their symbols at the cardinal points. This conception must be very ancient, as it is also represented by the Egyptians, with Horus and his 4 sons. Horus and his 4 sons, as is well known, have very close relations with Christ and the 4 evangelists. Later, we find a highly interesting mandala in Jacob Boehmer's book on the soul. It is entirely clear there that it is a psycho-cosmic system with a strong Christian framework. He calls it the philosophical eye or the mirror of wisdom, clearly referring to secret knowledge. For the most part, mandalas take the form of a flower, cross, or wheel, with a distinct tendency towards the number 4, reminiscent of the Pythagorean tetractys as a fundamental number. There are also mandalas as sand designs used in rituals by the Pueblo Indians. The East naturally has the most beautiful mandalas, especially Tibetan Buddhism. In these mandalas, the symbols of our text are represented. I've also found mandala drawings among the mentally ill from people who surely have no idea of the connections mentioned here. Among my patients, I have observed some women who do not draw mandalas but rather dance them. There is even a term for this in India, mandala nritya, meaning mandala dance. The dance figures express the same meaning as the drawings. The patients themselves can say little about the meaning of the mandala symbols. They are merely fascinated by them and find them, in relation to their subjective emotional state, full of expression and effect. Our text promises to reveal the secret of the golden flower of the Great One. The golden flower is the light, and the light of heaven is Tao. The golden flower is a mandala symbol that I have often encountered among my patients. It is drawn either as a geometrically regular ornament in general view, or more specifically as a flower growing from a plant. The plant is often depicted as a bright-colored image emerging from an underlying darkness, bearing the flower of light. A similar symbol is the Christmas tree. Such drawings simultaneously express the origin of the golden flower, for according to the Jungian, the germinal vesicle is found there, which is none other than the yellow castle, the terrace of vitality, the 1-inch field, the 1-foot house, the purple hall of the city of jade, the dark gorge, the space of pre-heaven, the dragon castle on the seafloor. It is also called the border zone of the snowy mountains, the primordial gorge, the realm of supreme joy, the land without boundaries, and the altar where consciousness and life are produced. If a dying person does not know this germinal place, says the Jungian, they will not find the unity of consciousness and life in 1,000 births and 10,000 world ages. The principle in which everything is still one, and which therefore appears as the highest goal, lies at the bottom of the sea, in the darkness of the unconscious, in the germinal vesicle. Consciousness and life, or essence and life, Xing Ming, are still an inseparable unity here, blended like the seed of fire in the refining furnace. Within the germinal vesicle is the fire of the sovereign, and it is here that all sages begin their work. Take note of the analogies regarding fire. I'm familiar with a series of European mandala drawings where something like a plant seed, surrounded by layers, floats in water, with fire penetrating it from the depths. This generates growth, resulting in the birth of a great golden flower that grows from the germinal vesicle. This symbolism refers to a kind of alchemical process of refinement and ennobling. The darkness gives birth to light. From the lead of the water region grows the noble gold. The unconscious becomes conscious in the form of a life or growth process. A complete analogy to this is Kundalini Yoga from India. Thus, the union of consciousness and life takes place. When my patients sketch such images, it doesn't naturally occur by suggestion, as these images were made before I knew their meaning or their relation to Eastern practices, which I was completely ignorant of at the time. They arose entirely spontaneously from two sources. One source is the unconscious, which generates such fantasies spontaneously. The other source is life, which, when lived with the fullest devotion, gives an inkling of the self, of the individual essence. The perception of the latter source is expressed in the drawing. The first source compels one to surrender to life, for in complete agreement with the Eastern conception, the mandala symbol is not only an expression but also has an effect. It reacts upon its creator. Ancient magical effects are associated with this symbol because it originally descends from the protective circle, the enchanted circle, whose magic has been preserved in countless popular customs. The image's manifest purpose is to trace a sulcus primigenius, a magical furrow around the center, the templum mortis, the sacred precinct of the innermost personality, to prevent reflection or to ward off distractions from the external world. Magical practices are nothing but projections of psychic happenings, which here find their reapplication on the soul, acting like a kind of enchantment of one's own personality. That is, it is a sustained and facilitated retraction through the graphic process of attention, or rather participation, to an internal sacred precinct that is both the origin and goal of the soul. It contains that unity of life and consciousness, first held, then lost, and which must be found again, the unity of both, a state whose symbol would be the central white light, similar to the bardo. This light resides in the square inch or the face, meaning between the eyes. It is the manifestation of the creative point, an intensio in extensa, conceived together with the space of the square inch, the symbol of the extensive. Together they are the Tao, or essence, or consciousness. They bear luminous symbols and are therefore intensity. Consequently, life, Ming, would correspond to extension. The former has a yang character, the latter yin, in complete analogy with the fundamental Chinese idea. The mandala mentioned above, of a 15-and-a-half-year-old somnambulist I treated over 30 years ago shows, at its center, an inextensible source of vital force that, in its emanation, immediately encounters an opposing spatial principle, the enclosure or encircling. This is expressed in our text through the idea of the circular course. The circular course is not merely circular movement, but has, on the one hand, the meaning of isolation of the sacred precinct, and on the other the fixation and concentration of the solar wheel, which begins to turn, i.e., the sun is revitalized and starts its course. In other words, Tao begins to act and take over leadership. Doing transforms into non-doing. This means that all the peripheral is subordinated to the command of the central. Thus, it is said, movement is another name for mastery. Psychologically, this circular course would mean circling around oneself, thereby implying all aspects of the personality. The poles of light and darkness are set in circular motion, which results in an alternation of day and night. The lucidity of paradise alternates with the profound night full of terrors, as Goethe put it. Accordingly, the circular movement also has the moral meaning of verifying all the luminous and dark forces of human nature, and with them, all psychological suppositions of any kind, which is nothing but self-knowledge through self-incubation, i.e., tapas. A primitive presentation of the perfect being is the Platonic man, round on all sides, in whom even the sexes are unified. One of the most beautiful parallels to what is discussed here is the description of his central experience outlined by Edward Maitland, collaborator of Anna Kingsford. I follow his own words as closely as possible. He had discovered that by reflecting on an idea, he could see related ideas in long series, seemingly reaching back to their very source, which for him was the divine spirit. By concentrating on these series, he attempted to reach their origin. I had no knowledge and no hope when I decided to make this attempt. I was merely experimenting with this faculty. While sitting beside my writing desk to note the events in their series, I resolved to firmly maintain my external and peripheral consciousness, no matter how far I might go into my internal and central consciousness. For I did not know if I would be able to return to the former once I let it go, or if I would be able to remember the events. Finally, I succeeded, though with great fatigue, I must say. The tension caused by the effort to maintain both ends of consciousness simultaneously was very great. At first, I felt as if I was ascending a long staircase from the periphery to the center of a system that was at once my own, the solar and the cosmic. The three systems were different and yet identical. Finally, with a final effort, I managed to focus the rays of my consciousness on the desired focal point. And at the same moment, it appeared before me as if a sudden inflammation had fused all the rays into a unity, a prodigious, radiant white light whose power was so great that it almost repelled me. Although I felt I need investigate no further, I resolved nonetheless to ensure once more by trying to penetrate this brilliance that almost blinded me to see what it contained. With great effort, I succeeded. It was the duality of the sun, the hidden made manifest, the undefined defined, the unindividuated individuated. God as Lord, proving through his duality that God is both substance and force, love and will, feminine and masculine, mother and father. I found that God is two in one like man. He also observed something highlighted in our text, the suspension of breathing. He said that common breathing had ceased and a kind of internal breathing had replaced it, as if another person, different from his physical organism, had breathed within him. He considered this being to be Aristotle's entelechy and the Apostle Paul's inner Christ, the spiritual and substantial individuality engendered within the physical and phenomenal personality, thus representing the rebirth of man on a transcendental plane. This genuine experience contains all the essential symbols of our text. The phenomenon itself, i.e., the vision of the light, is a common experience for many mystics and is undoubtedly of the highest significance, for it appears in all places and all ages as the unconditional, containing both the greatest power and the highest meaning. Hildegard von Bingen, a significant personality even aside from her mysticism, expressed herself about her central vision in a very similar way. "Since my childhood," she says, "I have always seen a light in my soul, but not with external eyes, nor with the thoughts of my heart. My 5 external senses take no part in this. The light I perceive is not of a local nature, but is much brighter than a cloud that carries the sun. I can discern neither height, width, nor length in it. What I see or learn in such a vision remains long in my memory. I see, hear, and know at the same time, and I learn what I know as if in an instant. In this light I can discern absolutely no form. For me it is called the living light. While I enjoy the contemplation of this light, all sadness and pain disappear from my memory. I know personally a few people who know of this vision from their own experience. To the extent that it has been possible to make any determination about such a phenomenon, it seems to involve an acute state of consciousness, as intensive as it is abstract. A consciousness that, as Hildegard rightly indicates, illuminates areas of the psychic experience that would otherwise be shrouded in darkness. The fact that, in connection with this, bodily sensations often disappear shows that their specific energy is likely being withdrawn, probably used to reinforce the lucidity of the consciousness. The phenomenon is spontaneous. It comes and goes of its own accord. Its effect is astonishing, as it almost always produces a resolution of psychological complications, thereby bringing about a detachment of the inner personality from emotional and ideological entanglements. In this way, it creates a unity of being that is commonly experienced as liberation. Conscious will cannot achieve such symbolic unity, because consciousness is, in this case, only a part. The opponent is the collective unconscious, which does not understand the language of consciousness. Therefore, there is a need for magically effective symbols that contain those primitive analogies that speak to the unconscious. Only through symbols can the unconscious be reached and expressed, which is why individuation can never avoid symbols. The symbol is, on the one hand, the primitive expression of the unconscious, and, on the other, an idea that corresponds to the highest insight granted to consciousness. The oldest Mandalic drawing I know of is a so-called Paleolithic solar wheel discovered in Rhodesia. It is similarly based on the number 4. Things that reach so far back in the history of humanity naturally touch the deepest layers of the unconscious and make them accessible where conscious language proves entirely powerless. Such things cannot be created by thought, but must grow again from the dark depths of forgetfulness to express the highest insights of consciousness and the highest intuitions of the spirit, thus uniting the singularity of present consciousness with the primitive past of life. The phenomena of the path, the dissolution of consciousness, the encounter between narrowly defined, but therefore intensely clear, individual consciousness and the vast expanse of the collective unconscious is dangerous. The unconscious has a defined dissolving effect on consciousness. This effect even belongs, according to the explanations of Woo-Min Kim, to the specific phenomena of Chinese yoga practice. It is said that each partial thought acquires shape and becomes visible in color and form, and the soul's total power reveals its traces. The illustration in the book shows a sage immersed in contemplation with his head aflame, from which 5 human figures emerge, which then expand into 25 smaller figures. If this were established as a state, it would be a schizophrenic process. Hence, the instruction says, "The figures formed by the fire of the spirit are only empty colors and forms." The light of the essence reflects back to the original, the true. It is therefore understood why one falls back on the defensive figure of the protective circle, and the unity of consciousness must be preserved from being blown apart by the unconscious. Furthermore, the Chinese concept seeks to eliminate the dissolving effect of the unconscious by designating thought figures or partial thoughts as empty colors and forms, thus depotentiating them as much as possible. This thought runs throughout Buddhism, especially Mahayana, and culminates in the teachings to the dead in the Bardo Thodol, Tibetan Book of the Dead, which explains that even benevolent and malevolent gods are illusions that must still be overcome. It is certainly not the psychologist's role to establish the metaphysical truth or falsity of this idea. The psychologist must content himself with identifying, where possible, what is psychically effective, and he is not concerned with whether the figure in question is a transcendental illusion or not. Faith, not science, determines that. In any case, we are moving here in a field that long seemed beyond the reach of science. For that reason, it was regarded everywhere as an illusion. However, this assumption is by no means justified, as the substantiality of these things is not a scientific problem, since it lies beyond human perception and judgment, and thus also beyond any possibility of proof. Therefore, the psychologist is not concerned with the substance of these complexes, but solely with the psychic experience. Without a doubt, these are autonomously experienced psychic contents, equally incontestable as partial psychic systems that spontaneously appear in static states. Circumstantially, they evoke powerful impressions and effects, or manifest in mental disturbances as delusional ideas and hallucinations, thereby destroying the unity of the personality. The psychiatrist may be inclined to blame toxins and the like for schizophrenia or psychosis, disregarding the psychic contents. However, in psychogenic disorders, hysteria, obsessive neurosis, etc., where toxins and cell degeneration are not relevant, we see similar somnambulistic states and spontaneous splitting of complexes. Freud, of course, sought to explain these through the unconscious repression of sexuality, yet this explanation does not apply to all cases, as unconscious contents can also develop spontaneously that consciousness cannot assimilate. In such cases, the repression hypothesis fails. Furthermore, in daily life, we can observe the autonomy of psychic effects that, despite our best efforts to repress them, push against us, flooding the ego and overpowering it. It is no wonder, then, that the primitive person views such things as possession or the migration of a soul. Even our language reflects this. "I don't know what's gotten into him today," or "he's beside himself." It suggests possession. Even legal practice acknowledges diminished responsibility in states of passion. Autonomous psychic contents are, consequently, not an entirely rare experience. Such contents have an explosive effect on consciousness, but beyond common emotions, there are more subtle and complex affective states that can no longer be classified as mere emotions. Instead, they are complex psychic partial systems that, the more complicated they are, the more personality they exhibit. These systems are also constitutive elements of the psyche, and therefore must have a personality character. Such partial systems are found in mental illnesses, in psychogenic splits of personality, double personality, and very commonly in mediumistic phenomena. They can also be found in religious phenomena. Therefore, many of what were once gods have transformed from being persons into personified ideas, and finally, into abstract ideas. Unconscious contents, when brought to life, first appear as projected outward, and, through spiritual development, are gradually assimilated by consciousness via spatial projection and transformed into conscious ideas, thereby losing their originally autonomous and personal nature. As is well known, some of the ancient gods have, via astrology, become goals or qualities: martial, jovial, saturnine, erotic, logical, lunatic, etc. The instructions of the Bardo Thodol especially allow us to discern how great the danger is for consciousness to be dissolved by these figures. The dead are taught repeatedly not to take these figures as real, and not to confuse their dim glow with the pure white light of the Dharmakaya, the divine body of truth. In other words, not to project the one light of the highest consciousness into concretized figures, thus multiplying them into autonomous partial systems. If there were no danger in this and these partial systems were not threateningly autonomous and divergent, there would be no need for such urgent instructions. For the simple, faith-oriented mind of the Eastern man, this instruction is nearly equivalent to, for example, the Christian instruction not to be blinded by the illusion of a personal God, a Trinity, or countless angels and saints. If the tendencies toward fragmentation were not inherent qualities of the human psyche, partial systems would have never developed. In other words, gods or spirits would have never existed. This is why, due to the exclusive worship of consciousness, our times are so impious and profane. Our true religion is a monotheism of consciousness, a possession by consciousness with a fanatical denial of the existence of autonomous partial systems. However, we differ from Buddhist yoga teachings because we deny even the experiential reality of these partial systems. Therein lies a great psychic danger, because these partial systems, like any repressed content, compulsively generate false attitudes. Repressed content reappears in consciousness in an inappropriate form. This fact, obvious in cases of neurosis, also applies to collective psychic phenomena. Our time commits a fatal error in this regard. It believes it can intellectually critique religious facts. For instance, people think God is a hypothesis that can be intellectually affirmed or denied. They forget entirely that the reason humanity believes in the daemon has nothing to do with anything external, but is simply based on the candid perception of the violent internal effect of autonomous partial systems. This effect does not dissolve because its name is critiqued intellectually or dismissed as false. The effect remains constantly present collectively. Autonomous systems continuously act as the fundamental structure of the unconscious is not affected by the hesitations of a transient consciousness. If these partial systems are denied, imagining that they are nullified by critiquing their name, then their effect, though still existing, can no longer be understood or assimilated into consciousness. They then become an inexplicable source of disturbance, which is assumed to originate externally. This results in the projection of these partial systems and creates a dangerous situation, as the disruptive effects are now attributed to some external malice, which of course cannot be found anywhere except, for example, in the neighbor on the other side of the river. This leads to collective delusions, incitement to war, revolutions, in short, destructive mass psychoses. Madness is possession by an unconscious content that is not assimilated into consciousness because consciousness denies the existence of such contents and therefore cannot assimilate them. Religiously expressed, this means there is no longer any fear of God, and people suggest that everything has been reduced to human measure. This restriction of consciousness is always the shortest path to the asylum. I recommend the excellent exposition of this problem in H.G. Wells' Christina Alberta's Father. It should profoundly touch the enlightened European when, in the Wu Min Kim, it says, "The figures formed by the fire of the spirit are only empty colors and forms." This sounds entirely European and seems to fit perfectly with our reason. In truth, we think we should feel elated to have reached these heights of clarity, as if we had long since left behind such ghostly gods. But what we have overcome are only the ghosts of words, not the psychic facts that gave rise to the gods. We are still just as possessed by our autonomous psychic contents as if they were gods. Now they are called phobias, obsessions, etc. In short, neurotic symptoms. The gods have become diseases, and Zeus no longer reigns over Olympus but over the solar plexus. If he provokes curiosity, it is for the medical consultation, or he disturbs the minds of politicians and journalists who inadvertently trigger psychic epidemics. For this reason, it is better for the Western man not to learn too much too quickly about the secret knowledge of Eastern sages. It would be the right tool in the wrong hands. Instead of having it reaffirmed that the daemon is an illusion, the Westerner should once again experience the reality of that illusion. He should learn to recognize these psychic forces anew, rather than wait until his moods, nervousness, or delusions painfully make it clear that he is not the sole master in his own house. The tendencies toward fragmentation are effective psychic personalities with relative reality. They are real when they are not recognized as such and are therefore projected. They are relatively real when connected with consciousness, religiously expressed when there is a cult, but they are most real when consciousness begins to separate from its contents. However, this only happens when life has been lived so fully and with such devotion that no absolute vital obligation remains, and no demand that cannot be sacrificed without hesitation. Then one is already on the path toward internal superiority over the world. There is no use lying about this. Wherever one is still stuck, one remains possessed, and if one is possessed, there is still something stronger possessing the person. Truly, I tell you, you will not come out of there until you have paid the last penny. It is not entirely indifferent whether something is called a mania or a god. To be in the service of a mania is reproachable and unworthy, while serving a god implies submission to something higher, invisible and spiritual, significantly richer in meaning and perspectives. The personification of autonomous partial systems already grants them relative reality, and with that, the possibility of assimilation and the realization of life's potentials. Where the god is not recognized, selfish mania arises, and from mania, sickness. The doctrine of yoga assumes the recognition of gods as something self-evident. Its secret teaching is therefore reserved only for those whose light of consciousness is ready to separate from life's powers and enter the ultimate indivisible unity at the center of emptiness, where the god of emptiness and extreme vitality resides. As our text says, hearing such teachings is difficult to achieve in thousands of kalpas. It is evident that the veil of Maya cannot be lifted by mere intellectual decision, but requires the most thorough and painful preparation, which consists in settling all debts to life. As long as one remains tied down by any form of attachment, the veil is not lifted, and the height of free, illusionless consciousness is not reached. No trick or deceit can magically bring it about. It is an ideal that can only be fully realized in death. Until then, there are real and relatively real figures of the unconscious. The animus and anima are figures of the unconscious. According to our text, not only gods, but also animus and anima belong to the unconscious. The word Jung is translated by Wilhelm as anima, and indeed the concept fits perfectly. Jung is composed of the sign for clouds and the sign for demon. Thus, Jung means cloud demon, a higher soul breath belonging to the yang principle, and therefore masculine. After death, the Jung ascends and becomes a manifest spirit. The anima, written with the sign for white, and the sign for demon, hence white ghost, is the lower corporeal soul belonging to the yin principle, and therefore feminine. After death, the anima sinks and becomes the demon that returns to earth, the wandering soul, the spectre. The fact that both the animus and the anima separate after death and go their own independent ways demonstrates that, for Chinese consciousness, they are distinguishable psychic factors with clearly different effects. Despite their original unity in essence, in actuality and truth, they are two in the mansion of the creative. The animus resides in the heavenly heart, during the day dwelling in the eyes, meaning in consciousness. At night it echoes from the liver. It is that which we have received from the great void, the one that shares a figure with the origin. In contrast, the anima is the force of the heavy and turbid, bound to the carnal heart. Carnal desires and angry excitations are its effects. Anyone who, upon awakening, feels gloomy and depressed is bound by the anima. Many years before Wilhelm provided me with knowledge of this text, I was already using the concept of anima in an entirely analogous way to the Chinese definition, apart from all metaphysical positions. For the psychologist, the anima is not a transcendental being but something completely experiential, as is clearly shown by the Chinese definition. Affective states are immediate experiences. But why then speak of anima and not simply of mood? The reason for this is the following. Affections have an autonomous character, which is why most people are subject to them. Affections, however, are contents of consciousness and parts of the personality, and as such they have a personal character. They can therefore be easily personified, and they still are today, as previous examples have shown. Personification is not a mere idle invention, as an emotionally excited individual does not display an indifferent character, but a very specific one that differs from their usual self. Careful research shows that in men, the affective character has feminine traits. From this psychological fact derives the Chinese teaching of the soul, as well as my conception of the anima. A deeper introspection or ecstatic experience reveals the existence of a feminine figure in the unconscious, hence the designation anime, soul or psyche. The anima can also be defined as an imago, archetype, or sediment of all a man's experiences with women. This is why the image of the anima is usually projected onto women, as is well known and often sung about in poetry. The relationship that the anima has with the spectre, according to Chinese thought, is interesting for the parapsychologist, as spiritual controls are often of the opposite sex. Although I must approve of Wilhelm's translation of Jung as animus, there were certain important reasons for my choice of logos for the spirit of man, for his clarity of consciousness and rationality. The term animus is otherwise very appropriate, but in my opinion, logos fits better here. Chinese philosophy has spared certain difficulties that burden the task of the Western psychologist. Like all ancient spiritual activities, Chinese philosophy is an exclusive element of the human world. Its concepts are never taken psychologically, and therefore never examined for their relevance to the feminine psyche. However, the psychologist cannot ignore the existence of women and their particular psychology. This is why I prefer to translate Jung in men as logos. Wilhelm uses logos for the Chinese concept of ich-sin, which can also be translated as essence or creative consciousness. After death, Jung passes into Shen, the spirit, which is philosophically related to Shin. Since Chinese concepts are not logical viewpoints in our sense but intuitive ones, their meanings can only be understood from their usage and the composition of their characters, or from relations such as the one between Shen and Sin. Thus, Jung would represent the light of consciousness and rationality in man, originally stemming from the logos spermatikos of Shen and returning after death through Shen once again. The use of logos could be especially appropriate here, as it implies the idea of a universal essence, for man's clarity of consciousness and rationality is not something individually isolated, but universal. It is not personal, but in the deepest sense, suprapersonal, in direct opposition to anima, which is a personal demon manifesting in highly personal moods, thus giving rise to hostility. Considering these psychological facts, I have reserved the term animus exclusively for the feminine, because in women, the psyche shows a contrast to the anima in men. The animus of women is not primarily of an affective nature, but rather a quasi-intellectual essence, which can be aptly characterized by the term prejudice. It is not the spirit, but the emotional nature of the soul that corresponds to the conscious nature of a woman. The spirit is the soul, or rather the animus of a woman. Just as the anima in men consists primarily of lower affective affinities, the animus in women consists of lower judgments, or more precisely, opinions. For further expansion, I refer the reader to my previously cited work. The animus in women consists of a large number of preconceived opinions, which is why it is much less easily personified by a single figure and instead by a group or multitude. A good parapsychological example is the group known as Imperator in Mrs. Piper's Communications. The animus, at a lower level, is an inferior logos, a caricature of man's differentiated spirit, just as the anima at a lower level is a caricature of feminine eros. Wilhelm translates Itzin as logos, corresponding to the eros of a woman, while Ming is translated as fate, destiny, or fatality, and interpreted by Wilhelm as eros. Eros is the intertwining, logos is the discerning, separating light. Eros is affinity, logos is discrimination and detachment. Therefore, in a woman's animus, the inferior logos manifests as a lack of affinity, often as inaccessible prejudice or opinions that irritatingly have nothing to do with the nature of the object. I have often been criticized for personifying anima and animus in a similar way to mythology. However, this criticism would only be justified if it could be proven that I also mythologically concretize these concepts for psychological use. I must clarify that personification was not invented by me, but is inherent in the essence of the corresponding phenomena. It would be unscientific to overlook the fact that the anima is a partial psychic system, and therefore personal. None of those who reproach me would hesitate for a second to say, "I dreamed of Mr. X," when in reality, they only dreamed of a representation of Mr. X. The anima is nothing more than a representation of the personal nature of the autonomous system in question. What that system is in a transcendental sense, beyond the limits of experience, we cannot know. I have also generally defined the anima as a personification of the unconscious and thus conceived it as a bridge to the unconscious, a connection to the unconscious. This interestingly aligns with the assertion in our text that consciousness, that is, personal consciousness, originates from the anima. Since the Western mind is entirely rooted in the viewpoint of consciousness, it must define the anima in the way I have just done. Conversely, however, the Eastern mind, rooted in the viewpoint of the unconscious, considers consciousness an effect of the anima. Undoubtedly, consciousness originally derives from the unconscious. This is something we commonly forget, and therefore we always attempt to identify them, usually presenting the unconscious as a derivative or an effect of consciousness, as seen, for example, in Freud's theory of repression. However, based on the reasons cited above, it is essential that nothing is taken away from the reality of the unconscious and that the figures of the unconscious are understood as effective entities. Anyone who has grasped what is meant by psychic reality need not fear falling back into primitive demonology. Indeed, if we do not assign the figures of the unconscious the dignity of spontaneously effective entities, we fall into a one-sided belief in consciousness, which ultimately leads to a state of tension. Catastrophes must then occur, for despite all awareness, the dark psychic powers have been overlooked. It is not we who personify them from the outset, they are of a personal nature. Only when this is fully recognized can we begin to think of depersonalizing them, that is, as our text expresses it, subduing the anima. Here, a dangerous and apparent similarity reveals a significant difference between Buddhism and our Western spiritual position. Yoga doctrine rejects all fantastic contents, as do we, but the Eastern approach is based on an entirely different foundation. In the East, concepts and teachings abound that express creative fantasy in the most plentiful manner. There, one must defend against an excess of fantasy, whereas we, in contrast, regard fantasy as a miserable, subjective dream. The figures of the unconscious do not appear naturally abstract and stripped of all accessory elements. On the contrary, they are given and intertwined in a tapestry of fantasies, incredibly varied and confusingly abundant. The East can repudiate these fantasies because long ago it extracted and condensed their essence into the deep teachings of its wisdom. We, however, have not yet fully experienced those fantasies, let alone extracted their quintessence. Here we still have an entire realm of experiential knowledge to recover. Only when we have found the meaningful content in what appears senseless can we separate the worthless from the valuable. And we can be sure that the extract we obtain from our experiences will differ from what the East offers today. The East arrived at knowledge of internal matters with a childlike ignorance of the world, while we, on the other hand, will explore the psyche and its depth supported by an extensive knowledge of history and the natural sciences. At present, external knowledge is above all the greatest obstacle to introspection, but psychic need overcomes all obstacles, for we are already constructing a psychology, that is, a science that provides us with the key to matters that the East accesses only through exceptional psychic states. Detaching consciousness from the object through understanding frees us from domination by the unconscious. This is, at its core, also the goal of the instructions in our text. The disciple is taught how to concentrate on the light of the innermost chamber, thereby freeing himself from all external and internal chains. His will to live is directed toward a state of contentless consciousness that, nonetheless, allows all contents to exist. The text hints at this detachment. A glow of light encircles the world of the spirit. One forgets oneself, completely still and pure, powerful and empty. The emptiness is illuminated by the glow of the heavenly heart. The sea is calm, reflecting the moon on its surface. Clouds soften in the blue space. The mountains appear clear. Consciousness dissolves into contemplating the moon's disk, resting solitary. This depiction of consummation describes a psychic state that can perhaps best be called a separation of consciousness from the world and a withdrawal to an otherworldly point. Thus, consciousness is empty but not void. It is no longer preoccupied with the images of things but simply contains them. The former fullness of the world, immediate and oppressive, has lost none of its abundance and beauty, but it no longer dominates consciousness. The magical claim of things has ceased because the original entanglement of consciousness with the world has been unraveled. The unconscious is no longer projected, which annuls the original mystical participation with things. As a result, consciousness is no longer filled with compulsive intentions, but rather moves into contemplation. As the Chinese text aptly states, how does this effect occur? We assume first that the Chinese author is not a liar, second that he has sound judgment, and third that he is an extraordinarily insightful individual. To understand or explain this, certain detours are needed for our understanding. It is not done with external feeling, for nothing would be more childish than to want to aestheticize such a psychic state. What is at issue here is an effect I know very well from my medical practice. It is the therapeutic effect par excellence, which I work toward with my disciples and patients, the dissolution of the participation mystique. Lévi-Brühl has insightfully exposed this as a hallmark of the primitive mindset, which I call participation mystique. What he designates is nothing other than the vast remnant of undifferentiation between subject and object that, among primitives, still possesses such dimensions that it cannot fail to astonish individuals of European consciousness. As long as the distinction between subject and object is not conscious, unconscious identity reigns. Then the unconscious is projected onto the object, and the object is projected into the subject, that is, psychologically speaking. Animals and plants behave like humans, and humans are simultaneously animals. Everything is animated with spectres and gods. So-called culture, of course, considers itself immensely elevated above such things, yet it often remains identified throughout its entire life with parents, affections, and prejudices, brazenly asserting about others what it refuses to see in itself. Thus, it still retains an initial unconsciousness, that is, an undifferentiation of subject and object. By virtue of this unconsciousness, it is magically affected by countless people, things, and circumstances, meaning it is unconditionally influenced and filled with disturbing contents, much like the primitive. Consequently, it uses an equal amount of magical protective measures, though no longer with pouches, amulets, or animal sacrifices, but with nerve remedies, psychoanalysis, willpower cults, and so forth. Now, if one succeeds in recognizing the unconscious as an entity co-conditioning consciousness and living in a way that takes both conscious and unconscious or instinctual demands into account, then the center of gravity of the personality is no longer the ego, which is merely the center of consciousness, but a point that can be called the self. If this shift is achieved, the result is the dissolution of the participation mystique, giving rise to a personality that, so to speak, only suffers in its lower levels, while at higher levels, it is remarkably detached from painful or joyous events. The production and birth of this personality is the goal of our text. When speaking of the holy fruit of the diamond body, or in some other way about a body in decay, such expressions are psychologically symbolic of an attitude invulnerable to unconditioned emotional conflict and thus to violent upheaval. In other words, they symbolize a consciousness detached from the world. I have reason to believe that this is truly a natural preparation for death, instituted after the midpoint of life. For the soul, death is as important as birth. Like it, it is an integral element of life. One does not have the right to ask the psychologist what ultimately happens to detached consciousness. Whatever theoretical position one takes would hopelessly exceed the limits of their scientific competence. I can only indicate that what our text asserts regarding the timelessness of separated consciousness is in harmony with the religious thought of all times and with the overwhelming majority of humanity. Therefore, anyone who does not think this way is outside the order of humanity and consequently suffers from a disturbed psychic equilibrium. For this reason, as a physician, I take all work to support the conviction in immortality, especially among my older patients, for whom such questions loom with threatening proximity. Death, when viewed psychologically in the correct manner, is not an end but a goal. Thus, life begins for death as soon as one surpasses the height of midday. The philosophy of Chinese yoga is founded on the instinctive preparation for death as a goal, analogous to the goal of the first half of life, namely, generation and propagation. The means of perpetuating physical life aims for the spiritual existence of symbolic generation and births of a psychic body, which ensures the continuity of detached consciousness. This is the birth of the pneumatic man, known since ancient times to Europeans who seek to attain it through symbols and magical procedures entirely different from Christian faith and conduct. Here too we find ourselves again on a foundation that is completely different from that of the East. Again, our text resonates as if it were not distant from Christian ascetic morality. However, nothing could be more close than to accept that it is the same. Behind our text lies the millennia-old culture that has organically built itself on primitive instincts and therefore knows nothing at all of that brutal morality that is appropriate for recently civilized Germanic barbarians. Thus, there is a drive for the violent repression of instincts that exalts and hysterically poisons our spirituality. One who lives their instincts can also separate from them, just as naturally as they have lived them. Nothing would be more alien to our text than the heroic conquering of oneself, which in turn would inevitably lead to that among us. If we observe closely, we literally have the Chinese instructions. We do not have the right to forget our historical premises. Just over 1,000 years ago, we fell from the most brutal beginnings of polytheism into a highly developed Eastern religion that elevated the imaginative spirit of the semi-savage to a height that did not correspond to the level of their spiritual development. To somehow maintain that height, it was necessary to broadly repress the sphere of instincts. That is why religious practice and morality adopted a manifestly brutal, almost malignant character. Naturally, the repressed does not develop. It continues to vegetate in primitive barbarism within the unconscious. Certainly we would like to, but in fact we are not at all capable of scaling the heights of a philosophical religion. The best we can do in this regard is to grow towards it. The wounds of our history have not yet healed. Thus the Faustian tearing of the Germanic man. His unconscious is still burdened with those contents that must first be made conscious before one can free oneself from them. I recently received a letter from an old patient who describes in simple but accurate words the necessary transposition of what is bad. Much good has come to me from maintaining my calm, not repressing, being attentive, and at the same time accepting reality as it is, not as I would like it to be. This has provided me with a rare discernment and also uncommon strengths that I could not have imagined before. I always thought that accepting things would somehow overwhelm one. However, this is not the case at all, and only by accepting them can one adopt a position towards them. This is an annulment of the participation mystique, so I will now play the game of living, accepting whatever each day and life brings me, good and bad, sun and shadow, which constantly change. Thus, I also accept my own nature with its positive and negative aspects, and everything will be more alive than when I foolishly tried to force everything according to my head. Only on the basis of such an attitude, which does not renounce any of the values acquired during Christian development, but rather, on the contrary, also accepts with love and Christian forbearance the most humble aspects of one's own nature, will a higher level of consciousness and culture be possible. That attitude is religious in its most legitimate sense, and therefore therapeutic, since all religions are therapies for the sufferings and disturbances of the soul. The development of Western intellect and will has given us the almost diabolical ability to apparently and successfully imitate this attitude, despite the protests of the unconscious. But it is always a matter of time before the opposite position breaks through in some way, with a contrast all the more severe against the comfortable, invariant imitation. An insecure situation is thus created that can be toppled at any moment by the unconscious. A secure foundation only emerges when the instinctive premises of the unconscious are given equal consideration to the perspective of consciousness. But let us not deceive ourselves. This need is in violent opposition to the Western Christian cult of consciousness, especially the Protestant one. However, although it may seem that the new is constantly at odds with the old, a deeper desire to understand cannot help but discover that without the most serious application of the values conquered through Christianity, the new cannot establish itself at all. The consummation of the growing knowledge of Eastern spirituality can only symbolize the fact that we are beginning to come into contact with what is still foreign within us. Renouncing our own historical premises would be sheer madness and the best path toward a new uprooting. Only by standing firm on our own ground can we assimilate the spirit of the East. You say that the people of the world have lost their roots and have taken to the treetops, characterizing those who do not know where the true origins of secret forces lie. The spirit of the East has arisen from the yellow earth. Our spirit can and must arise only from our own land. For this reason, I approach these problems in a way that has often been criticized as psychologism. If by this one means psychology, I would be flattered, because my real intention is to strip away the metaphysical pretense from all secret teachings. Such objective secrets of the power of words are at odds with the fact of our profound ignorance, which one must have the discretion to confess. I aim with the fullest intention to bring to the light of psychological understanding certain matters of a metaphysical sound, and do what I can to prevent the public from believing in obscure words of power. Whoever is a convinced Christian should believe in them. Such is their assumed duty. Whoever is not has lost the grace of faith through their own fault. Perhaps they have been cursed since birth, to be unable to believe but merely to know. Hence they should not believe in anything else either. To comprehend metaphysically is impossible. It can only be done psychologically. Therefore, I strip things of their metaphysical aspects to make them objects of psychology. This way, I can at least extract something comprehensible from them and appropriate it. Moreover, I learn in such a way about conditions and psychological processes that were previously veiled in symbols and hidden from my intelligence. Thus, he also reached the possibility of traversing a similar path and having a similar experience. If there was still something metaphysical and unrepresentable behind it at the end, it would have the best opportunity to manifest itself. My admiration for the great Eastern philosophers is as undeniable as it is irreverent. My position towards their metaphysics, indeed, leads me to suspect that they are symbolic psychologists, and there could be no greater injustice than to take them literally. If what they imply were truly metaphysics, it would be useless to try to understand it. However, it is psychology. We can understand them, and we will gain tremendous benefit from this, for then what is called metaphysical becomes experiential. If I accept that a God is absolute beyond all human experience, that God leaves me cold. I do not act upon it, nor does it act upon me. If, on the other hand, I know that a God is a powerful activity of my soul, then I must attend to it, for it can become unfortunately significant even in practice, something that sounds enormously trivial, like everything that appears in the sphere of reality. The injurious word psychologism only applies to fools who believe they have their soul in their pocket. Indeed, there are more than enough of them, since the devaluation of mystical things is a typically Western prejudice, despite all the grand phrases often made about the soul. When I use the complex concept of an autonomous psyche, it is already among my audience, who lend it no more than a prejudiced perception. Where does this certainty come from that the soul is nothing more than it is? It is as if absolutely nothing is known, or one forgets again and again that everything that becomes conscious is an image, and the image is the soul. The same people who opine that God is despised if understood as the mover and motor of the soul, just as an autonomous complex can be visited by invincible affections and neurotic states where their wills and their entire wisdom of life fail deplorably. Should the soul's impotence be reproached to psychologism when it states that God must continuously be born in the soul? In my opinion, the only reproach should be directed towards an intellect that denies the genuine nature of the autonomous complex and seeks to explain it rationally as a consequence of known facts. This is inappropriate. That judgment is as arrogant as the metaphysical assertion that, above and far beyond the limits of humanity, attempts to entrust a deity with experience. The production of our psychic states, psychologism is simply the counterpart of the usurping attitude toward the goal and is exactly as childish as the latter. I find it essential to grant the soul the same validity as the world. I experience and admit that the former has as much reality as the latter. For me, indeed, the soul is a world in which the self is contained. Perhaps there are also fish that believe they contain the sea within themselves. But to consider the metaphysical from a psychological perspective, we must first eliminate within ourselves that widespread illusion. A metaphysical assertion of that kind is the idea of the diamond body, or the body of the psychic breath, an input stable that is born in the golden flower or in the space of the square inch. This body symbolizes a remarkable psychological fact that, precisely because it is objective, first appears projected in forms provided by the experiences of biological life. This is like the fruit, embryo, child, living body, etc. This fact can be expressed in the simplest terms with the words, "I do not live, I am lived." The illusion of superiority of consciousness believes I live. If that illusion were to collapse due to the recognition of the unconscious would appear as something objective in which the self is spent. Perhaps the attitude toward the unconscious is analogous to the feeling of the primitive man, to whom a sun guarantees the continuity of life, a very peculiar feeling that can even take on grotesque forms, as in the case of the old black man who, indignant at his disobedient son, exclaimed, "There he is with my body, and he does not obey me." This is a modification of the internal feeling similar to what a father experiences when a son is born. It is also a modification known to us through the confession of the Apostle Paul, "For now I live, but Christ lives in me." The symbol of Christ, as the Son of Man, represents an analogous psychic experience of a higher spiritual essence in human form that invisibly is born within the individual. A pneumatic body will serve as a future lodging, which can be donned like a garment, as you have put on Christ. Naturally, it is always questionable to express subtle feelings in conceptual intellectual language, which are infinitely important for the life and well-being of the individual. In a certain sense, it is the feeling of being replaced, but in truth, without the addition of the being dispossessed. It is as if the management of life's affairs has been handed over to an invisible central place. Nietzsche's metaphor of being free in absolute necessity would not be entirely out of place here. The religious language is rich in plastic expressions that describe that feeling of free dependence on calmness and devotion. In this remarkable experience, I perceive a phenomenon resulting from the detachment of consciousness, whereby the living subjective self passes to an objective, "it lives me." Such a state is experienced as higher than the previous one, as if it were, in fact, a sort of liberation from the compulsion and impossible responsibility that are the inevitable consequence of participation mystique. This feeling of liberation, which fully filled Paul, is the consciousness of divine filiation that redeems one from the spell of blood. It is also a feeling of reconciliation with what happens in general, for which reason the gaze of the consummated in the Wee Min Kim returns to the beauty of nature. In the Pauline symbol of Christ, the highest religious experience of the West and the East is touched upon. Christ, the hero laden with sorrows, and the golden flower that opens in the purple room of the city. I will leave it at that. The opposition. What an unimaginable difference. What a historical abyss. A suitable problem for the future psychologist's masterpiece, alongside the great religious problems of the present, is the very small one of the progress of the religious spirit. If this is to be discussed, the difference that exists between East and West regarding how to treat the jewel, that is, the central symbol, should be highlighted. The West emphasizes the incarnation and even the person and historicity of Christ, while the East, on the other hand, speaks of a being without birth, without disappearance, without past or future. Corresponding to this conception, the Christian is subordinated to the superior divine person in expectation of grace. The Eastern man, on the other hand, knows that redemption rests upon the work one does upon oneself. The individual grows or integrates the Christian imitation. This will have the disadvantage that we see a man as the divine model, embodying the highest meaning solely by pure imitation. Let us forget to realize our own highest meaning. Indeed, it is not entirely uncomfortable to renounce one's own meaning. If Jesus had done so, he would have become an honorable carpenter and not a religious rebel, who today would naturally find himself in the same predicament as then. Imitation can easily also be understood more deeply. This is the obligation to realize the best conviction, which is always also the fullest expression of the individual temperament, with such courage and such ultimate sacrifice as Jesus did. Fortunately, not everyone has the mission of being a master of humanity or a great rebel. Consequently, each person can ultimately realize themselves in their own way, perhaps even achieving great honesty, which could become an ideal, since great novelties always begin in the most improbable corner. The fact that today a person does not feel ashamed of their nakedness as much as they once did might signify, for example, that they are beginning to recognize themselves as they truly are. From this, further recognitions of things that were once strict taboos will follow, for the reality of the earth will not remain veiled forever, like the Ver Jans Belhanda of Tertullian. Moral self-revelation simply means a further step in the same direction, and one is already in reality as it is, and as one confesses oneself to be. If one does so without meaning, it is somewhat chaotic. But if one understands the meaning of what they do, they can become a superior man who, despite suffering, realizes the symbol of Christ. It is often seen that taboos are purely concrete or magical rites in a primitive stage of a religion, and they become, in the next stage, a psychic matter or purely spiritual symbols. In the course of development, external law can become internal conviction. Thus, it could easily happen to the loyal Protestant that the person of Jesus, existing externally in historical space, could become the superior man within. With this, the European way of reaching that psychological state corresponds in the Eastern conception to that of the enlightened. All this is a stage in the process of developing a higher human consciousness that is on its way toward unknown and not metaphysical goals in the vulgar sense. Above all, and to such an extent, it is only psychology, but also inasmuch as it is experientially understandable and, thank God, real. It is a reality with which something can be done, a reality with possibilities and therefore living. That I adhere to what is psychically experiential and reject the metaphysical does not imply, as one will understand, any gesture of skepticism or hardened agnosticism against faith or trust in superior powers. Rather, it means more or less the same thing as suggesting that when I call the thing in itself a limiting concept that is solely negative, all assertions about the transcendental should be avoided, for they are always a ridiculous presumption of the human spirit, unconscious of its limitations. Therefore, when God or the Tao is qualified as a commotion or a state of the soul, it merely affirms something about the locog, not about the incognizable of the Timo. Nothing can be said. Epilogue. The objective of my commentary is the attempt to build a bridge of inner psychic intelligence between the West and the East. The basis of all real understanding is man, And that is why I had to speak of human things. May this excuse my focus on the general rather than on the specifically technical. Technical instructions are valuable for those who know what a camera or a gasoline engine is. However, they make no sense for someone with no notion of such devices. In such a situation, the Western man for whom I write finds himself. And that is why it seemed to me that it was first important to highlight the concordance between psychic states and symbolism. Through those analogies, access opens to the inner chambers of the Eastern spirit, an access that demands the sacrifice of our singularity and does not threaten us with uprooting. It is not an intellectual telescope or microscope that allows for a perspective that ultimately does not concern us because it does not move us. It is rather the common atmosphere shared by all cultured men, the suffering, seeking, and striving, the enormous experiment imposed on humanity by nature to become conscious, that unites, as a common mission, the most separated cultures. Western consciousness is not, under any circumstances, merely science. Rather, it is a historically conditioned and geographically limited magnitude that represents only a part of humanity. The broadening of our consciousness should not come at the expense of other kinds of consciousness, but must take place through the development of those elements of our psyche that are analogous to the qualities of foreign psyches. Just as the East cannot abstain from our techniques, science, and industry, the European invasion of the East was a grand act of violence. It has left us noble airlines with the obligation to understand the spirit of the East. This is perhaps more necessary for us than we currently sense. Examples of European mandalas. The figures that follow have been made by patients in the course of their treatment in the manner mentioned in the text. The most recent dates from 1916. All figures were created spontaneously without the slightest Eastern influence. The hexagrams of the first gene in figure number 4 come from reading the translation of Layan the Acrid Soft of Ist, but they were only included in the figure because their contents seemed to the academically educated patient to be particularly significant for her life. None of the European mandalas, meaning a rather large collection known to me, achieves the harmony and perfection traditionally and conventionally fixed in the Eastern mandala. Therefore, I have selected 10 figures among the infinitely varied European mandalas that, as a whole, could at least clearly exemplify the parallelism of Eastern philosophy with the formation of unconscious European ideas. Origin and content of the workshop, Yinghua Song. This book comes from an esoteric circle in China. For a long time it was transmitted orally and then through manuscripts. The first print dates from the Qing period in the 18th century. Finally, it was reprinted in 1,000 copies in Beijing in 1920, together with the Wei Min Kim, and distributed to a small circle of men whom the editor presumed to have the intelligence for the issues under discussion. The new printing and dissemination of the book is based on a new awakening of religious currents in light of pressing political and economic circumstances in China. A series of secret sects had formed whose efforts were aimed at achieving, through the practical exercise of the secret traditions of ancient times, a psychic state that would lead out of all the miseries of life. Methods such as written prayer, sacrifice, etc. were employed alongside the widely disseminated medium sessions in China, through which a direct connection was sought with gods and the deceased, along with attempts with the plan set and the flying pencil, as the Chinese expression goes. But alongside this, an esoteric direction has been very energetically dedicated to the psychological method, to meditation, that is, to the practice of yoga. Its supporters also achieve central clairvoyance, almost without exception, unlike those European yogis for whom these Eastern exercises are merely sports. Thus, one can say that the Chinese psychic state, which, as CG has shown very accurately, is very essentially different from the European in some fundamental aspects, at least until recent times, is a perfectly assured method for achieving certain psychic experiences. Along with the liberation from the chains of the illusory external world, there are still several other goals that the various sects seek with effort. Those of a superior level seek liberation based on meditation and Buddhist nirvana. For example, this written work aims to prepare the possibility of continuing to live after death, not merely as a shadow being destined for dissolution, but as a collective spirit. Often combined with this are directions that, through meditation, attempt to influence psychically certain vital animal processes executed in a European manner. We would speak here of processes of the endocrine glandular system, Such influence would produce strengthening, rejuvenation, and normalization of the vital process, so that death would also be general in such a way that it would be included as a harmonious closure of the vital process. The earthly body is abandoned by the spiritual principle, capable of continuing to live independently in the spiritual body generated from its system of forces, leaving behind a shell drying out like the shell of a cicada's molt. At lower levels of these sects, there is a tendency to attain magical powers, the ability to conjure evil spirits and diseases, which also involve talismans and oral and written charms. Sometimes, all of this results in mass psychosis expressed in religious or political anxieties, such as the Boxer movement, for example. The unmistakable syncretistic trend of Taoism is manifested in the fact that its institutions welcome members from the 5 world religions: Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, Islam, and Christianity, with occasional mentions of Judaism, especially without the need to segregate from their religious communities. Having briefly outlined the backgrounds from which such movements arise today, a few words remain to be said about the sources from which the teachings of the present book originate. We now make very notable discoveries in this regard. These teachings are much older than their written fixation. If we look at Jim Watson's point, it can be traced as a print on wooden plates back to the 17th century. The compiler describes how he found a copy from this period, not entirely complete, in the Lilijang, the old street of antiquarians and booksellers in Beijing, which he then completed from a friend's book. The oral tradition dates back to the religion of the elixir of life, Jin Jiang Xiao, which originated in the Otan period during the 8th century, with the well-known Taoist adept Lu Jing Lu Dan Vin named as the founder, who later became mythologized by popular tradition as one of the 8 immortals, around whom a rich crown of myths has accumulated over time. This community had great dissemination during the Tang period, as all indigenous and foreign religions found tolerance and care. However, it suffered over time as its members were suspected of secret political intrigues. From the beginning, it was an esoteric secret religion, again facing persecution by a hostile government, ultimately in the most cruel manner by the Manchu government shortly before its own fall. Many of its members turned to the Christian religion, and all, including those who did not directly enter the church, have friendly feelings toward it. Our book provides the best information on the teachings of Yindan Qiao. The precepts trace back to Huyen, who is referred to by his other designation as blood and bean, meaning light, the guest of the cave. In the book, he is introduced as the patriarch Lulu Disu, who lived from the 8th to the 9th century and was born in 755 AD. A later commentary has been added to his words, but it stems from the same tradition from which Luthi obtained his esoteric secret teachings. He traces his origin back to Wang Jing and the Master Jimmy of the Canyon One, or New Canyon, for whom, according to legend, the Tao Te Ching was written. Indeed, within the system, there are a number of thoughts that arise from the mystical, esoteric teachings hidden in the Tao Te Ching. For example, the gods in the valley are identical to the spirit of the Valley of Night, etc. However, while Taoism during the Han period increasingly took on an external magic, as the court magicians of Taoist origin sought through alchemical methods, the golden pill, the philosopher's stone that would engender gold from common metals and grant men physical immortality, the movement of Huyen represented a reform. The chemical designations became symbols of psychological processes, signifying a new approach to the original thoughts of the night. However, the OTS was a thinker, and his successor, the Swansea, sometimes mocked all the maneuvers of the yoga practices of the natural curers and seekers of the elixir of life, even though he himself had naturally practiced meditation, which helped him attain the vision of the unity on which his later reflexively developed system rests. Conversely, in Lu Yen, we find a certain credulity, a religious tendency encouraged by Buddhism, which convinced him of the illusion of all that is external, though in a way that clearly differs from Buddhism. He seeks with all his strength the fixed pole in the escape of phenomena, where the adept can partake in eternal life, a thought entirely alien to Buddhism which denies all substance. However, one should not underestimate the influence of Mahayana Buddhism, which then dominated China. The Buddhist sutras are cited repeatedly in our text. This influence is certainly greater than can generally be acknowledged in the Jimdanya, or in the second half of the 3rd section, where the method of fixed contemplation is expressly indicated. This is a purely Buddhist method practiced in the Tian school and the Sika. From then on, a certain gap can be observed in the exposition of our text. On one hand, the care of the golden flower is described, but on the other, purely Buddhist thoughts emerge that displace the goal towards the proximity of nirvana. Subsequently, some sections follow which, when considering the spiritual level and the rigor of coherence of the work as a whole, could aspire to greater consultative value. Moreover, only in its early stages is the work on internal rebirth described through the circular course of light and the generation of the following divine, although the later stages are designated as goals. See in this regard the Sum Infant of Lujan, where those last stages are explained in greater detail. We cannot therefore dismiss the supposition that a part of the manuscript was indeed lost, having been replaced from another source. That would explain the aforementioned gap and the inferior level of the untranslated parts. However, upon reading without preconceptions, it is striking that these two sources do not fully cover the thoughts involved. Confucianism is also utilized in its direction, based on the first yin. The 8 basic signs of the first yin of water are introduced in various passages as symbols for certain internal processes. Later, we will try to explain the influence exerted by this application of symbols. Moreover, Confucianism shares a broad foundation with Taoism, so that such a unification of thoughts did not disturb the coherence of the exposition at all. Perhaps many European readers will be surprised that expressions appear in the text that are already familiar to them from Christian teachings. On the other hand, precisely these things that are generally taken in Europe only as ecclesiastical metaphors take on a wholly different perspective due to the psychological correlations in which they are introduced. We find ideas and concepts such as the following. To take just a few particularly striking examples: light is the life of men, the eye is the light of the body, the spiritual rebirth of man from water and fire, to which earth thought, spirit as a maternal womb or cultivated field should be added. To compare, take the words of John Osvaldo, "With water one will come after me who will baptize you with the Holy Spirit and fire," or, "Unless a man is born of water and the Spirit, he cannot enter the kingdom of God." How plastic the thought of water as a subsequent substance becomes in our text, and how clear the difference between the activity that flows outward, which exhausts itself in engendering what is born of the flesh is flesh, and the retrogressive movement metaboia as well. The bath plays a part in this rebirth, just as in the baptism of John and in the Christian tradition. However, even the mystical weddings that have such a significant role in Christian parables appear several times. The eternal child, the Christ who must be born in us, is also mentioned, and on the other hand, he is the promised one of the soul within us, as well as the bride. What may be even more surprising is that a seemingly secondary feature, such as having oil in the lamp so that they burn brightly, acquires through our text a new and powerful psychological significance. It is worth mentioning that the expression golden flower, Jinjue, also contains in an esoteric sense the expression light. Indeed, if the characters are written one below the other, so that the bottom part of the upper one touches the top part of the lower one, they form the character for light, Wang. Evidently, this secret character was invented during a period of persecution, which may have also motivated the subsequent dissemination of the teaching to only occur under the veil of the deepest secrecy, to avoid all possible danger. This was undoubtedly the reason that the teachings remained limited to secret circles. Even today, its adherents are more numerous than could be believed from the outside. If we now ask where this religion of light points to, we can first think of Persia, for in the Tang period there were Persian temples in many places in China. But while some features correspond to the religion of Zoroaster, and particularly to Persian mysticism, there are also very notable divergences. Another opinion to consider is that of a direct Christian influence during the Tang period, which gained great prestige. Nestorianism was indeed the religion of the wars, allied with the emperor, as demonstrated by its Chinese and Syrian inscriptions on the well-known Nestorian monument in Xi'an, erected in 781. Therefore, the relationships between the Nestorians are very possible. Richard went so far as to see in Xi'an simply the remnants of the ancient Nestorian presence. Certain correspondences in the ritual and some traditions of the members of the Yin-Yang Xiao have recently been pointed out by Pei Saik, who has resumed this theory and established a series of further parallels linked by the Nestorian liturgy found in Dan Juan. Pesach even goes so far as to identify the founder of the yin-yang xiao with Adam, the chronicler of the text of the Nestorian commemorative plaque, who signs with the Chinese name Lu. According to this, Lu Yen, the founder of the Yin Dan Jiao, would have been a Christian of the Nestorian confession. If he stretches his quest for identification too far, his evidence is almost all convincing, but always lacks the crucial point that would round out the demonstration. Many half-evidence do not make a complete one, but we must agree with him that there has been a very intense influx of Nestorian thoughts in the Jim Dan Jiao, which is also asserted in the present writing. These thoughts have in part a rare appearance in foreign attire, and in part receive a notable kind of new vitality. Here we reach one of the points that repeatedly prove that East and West must not remain separate. The psychological and cosmological premises of the work for understanding our translation of the text will benefit from a few words about the foundations of the worldview on which the method rests. This worldview is to a certain degree a common property of all Chinese philosophical directions. It is based on the premise that cosmos and man obey in essence common laws, that man is a cosmos in miniature and not separate from the great cosmos by solid barriers. The same laws govern both, and from one state, access to the other is revealed. Psyche and cosmos behave as inner and outer worlds. For this reason, man naturally participates in all cosmic happenings and is intertwined with them both internally and externally, and the meaning of the world thus dominates man, as does the visible and invisible nature, heaven and earth. The original sign consists of a head that must be interpreted as a beginning, then in the sign to go, and this in its double form, which also means way, and then below the sign, remain still, which was omitted in the later spelling. Consequently, the original meaning is a path that, being fixed in itself, leads directly from a beginning to the goal. The fundamental thought is thus that the unmoving itself allows all movement and gives it the law. The orbits of the heavens are the orbits in which the stars move. The way of man is the path by which he will march. The term has been used in a metaphysical sense as the ultimate principle of the world, as the meaning before all realization, not yet separated by the polar divergence of opposites with which all realization is linked. In the present book, this terminology is assumed. In Confucianism, there is a slight difference. The term has here a sense of the inner world, equating the correct path on one side with the path of heaven and on the other side with the path of man. The ultimate principle of unique unity is for Confucianism the tiger and the great beam, the great pole. The expression or also appears occasionally in our text, being then identical to Tao of the Tao. That is, from the tiger arise now the principles of reality, the luminous polar, yang, and the dark or gloomy polar, yin. Initially, there was an attempt to explain these principles within the circle of European researchers with reference to the sexual. However, the signs relate to natural phenomena. Jim is shadow, and therefore the north side of a mountain and the south side of a river, because the sun is positioned during the day in such a way that it appears dark from the south. Yang shows in its original form a pennant, corresponding to the yin sign, the south side of a mountain and the north side of the river. Only from such meanings of luminous and dark is the principle then extended to all polar opposites, including the sexual. However, since both are active only within the phenomenal field, and have their common origin in the one unique, where yang appears as the active conditioning principle and yin as the passive derived and conditioned principle, it is entirely clear that there is no metaphysical dualism in the foundation of this thought. Less abstract than yin and yang are the concepts of the creative and the receptive, which arise from the Book of Mutations and are symbolized by heaven and earth. Through the union of heaven and earth, and by the effectiveness of which primordial forces within that scene, according to a primal law, are born the 10,000 things, that is, the external world. Among those things, the man is also considered externally in his bodily manifestation, which in all its parts is a little universe. If we consider, as the Confucianists say, the interior of man comes from heaven, or is a phenomenal form of Tao, as the Taoists express it, in his phenomenal form, the man unfolds in a multiplicity of individuals, in each of which is included the one central principle of life. Only that immediately, even before birth at the moment of conception, diverges polarly into essence and life. The sign for essence, sin, consists of a heart, sin, and rise, nasa. In the heart, sin is, according to Chinese conception, the seat of emotional consciousness, which is awakened by sentimental reactions to impressions from the external world through the five senses. What remains as a substrate when no feeling is externalized, which consequently remains, so to speak, still in a transcendent superconscious state, is the essence, sin, according to the most precise definition. This concept is originally bad when considered from the perspective of empirical historical development. Sanhuan, at least neutrally, must be made good through a long development of custom. The essence, sin, which is in any case close to the logos, presents itself when it enters the domain of the phenomenal, closely tied to life, min. The sign, min for life, means in reality a mandate from the king and, consequently, regulation, fatality, the destiny assigned to a man. Thus, the duration of life is the measure of vital force, the disposition of one. Hence, the term min for life is very close to eros. Both principles are, so to speak, supra-individual. The essence, sin, is what makes man man as a spiritual being. The individual man possesses it, but it extends far beyond the individual. Life, min, is also supra-individual, given that man must simply accept his fate, which does not depend on his conscious will. Confucianism sees it as a law determined by heaven to which one must resign. Taoism views it as the multicolored play of nature, which, of course, cannot elude the laws of Tao, but is, as such, simply chance. For Chinese Buddhism, it is the operation of karma within the world of illusion. To these qualities correspond now, in the corporeal personal name, the following polar tensions. The body is enlivened by the co-participation of two psychic structures. The term Jun translates to anima, given that it belongs to the yang principle, and yin, which I have translated as anima. Both are ideas arising from the observation of the circumstances of death. Hence, they also bear the sign of demon of the deceased. The anima was imagined as primarily linked to bodily processes, sinking into the earth at the moment of death and corrupting. The inem is, in contrast, the higher soul that ascends into the air after death, where it is initially active for a time and then volatilizes into celestial space. That is, it refluxes into the general reservoir of life in living man. Both correspond to a certain degree with the cerebral and solar system. The anime resides in the eyes, while the anima is in the lower abdomen. The anime is luminous and mobile. The anima is dark and bound to the earth. The sign for Jungian is composed of demon and cloud, while the sign for anima consists of demon and white. Can we perhaps deduce similar thoughts to those we find again elsewhere, such as soul, shadow, and soul, body? Undoubtedly, something similar is also inherent in the Chinese conception. We must, however, be cautious in the derivation, given that the older spelling did not yet have a sign class for demon, and it could possibly refer to primordial symbols whose derivations have been lost. In any case, the animes together form the luminous yang soul, while the anima is the dark yin soul. Now, as a direct life process that is descending, is the one in which both souls remain related to each other as intellectual and animal factors. Generally, it will be the anima, the blunt will spurred by passions, that forces its service to the animes or intellect, at least to the extent that it turns outward, causing the forces of anem and anima to slip away, and life is consumed as a positive result. The generation of new beings occurs in which life continues, while the original being externalizes and is finally made a thing by things. The final point is death. The anima sinks, the anime ascends, and the self is now stripped of its strength in a dubious state. If it has consented to externalization, heaviness follows, and it sinks into the blunt sorrow of death, miserably feeding only on the illusory images of life to which it is still always attracted, unable to actively participate in them, hungry souls in hell, and on the other hand, despite externalization, it has strived to ascend, at least for a time, as long as the forces of sacrifices of those who survive it fortify it. A relatively beatific life will be granted to each according to their merits. In both cases, the personal retreats and an evolution corresponding to the externalization is fulfilled. Being turns into an imposing ghost because it lacks the forces of life, and its destiny is at an end. Now it lives the fruits of its good and bad actions in the heaven-hell that are, however, nothing external but purely internal states. The more it sinks into those states, the more it becomes enwrapped, until it finally disappears from the face of existence, only to enter a new maternal womb and initiate a new existence formed on the basis of its reservoir of images and memories. Such a state is the state of the demon of the spirit that returns from which it desists, often mistakenly translated in Chinese as if, on the contrary, it achieves during life to introduce the retrograde ascending movement of vital forces. If the forces of the anima are dominated from the animes, a liberation occurs concerning external things. They are discerned but not coveted. Thus, the illusion is broken in its strength, and an internal ascending circulation of forces takes place. The helio is torn from the entanglements of the world and remains alive after death, because the internalization has prevented the outpouring of vital forces outward, and instead, they have created a center of life in the internal rotation of the monad that is independent of bodily existence. A self like this is a god. Daios is the sign for this, meaning to extend, to act. In short, the opposite of vi. In the older writing, it is represented by a double sign of meanders that also meant in other cases thunder, lightning, electrical excitement. Such a being possesses duration as long as the internal rotation persists. It can also influence from the invisible on men and inspire them to great thoughts and noble ways of acting. Those are the saints and sages of ancient times who have animated and educated humanity for thousands of years. However, there remains a limitation. Those beings are still always personal and therefore subjected to the actions of space and time. They are not more immortal than they are eternal. Heaven and earth are eternal. Only the golden flower that arises by virtue of the internal disengagement from all obligation to things. A man who has reached that rung transcends his own. He is no longer limited to anything but penetrates into the magical circle of the polar duality of all phenomena and returns to the unique one. Here, there is now a difference between Buddhism and Taoism. In Buddhism, that return to nirvana is linked to the full extinction of the self, which is as itself the world, only illusion. While it cannot be explained as a death, a cessation, it is, however, decidedly transcendent. In Taoism, on the other hand, the goal is that in transfiguration, the idea of the person is observed, so to speak, the traces of experiences. This is the light that, with life, returns upon itself and is symbolized in our text by the golden flower. As a supplement, let us say a few words about how the 8 signs from the Book of Changes are used in our text. The sign for thunder, Jing, signifies the life that bursts forth from the depths of the earth. It is the principle of all movement. The sign for windward, sun, characterizes the flow of the forces of reality within the form of the idea. Just as the wind penetrates all spaces, this principle penetrates everything and creates realization. The sign for sunfire, Li, the brilliant and adhesive, plays a major role in this religion of light, dwelling in the eyes, creating the guardian circle and producing rebirth. The sign for earth, Kun, the receptive, is one of the 2 primordial principles, the yin principle that is realized in the forces of the earth. The earth is that which, like a cultivated field, receives the seed from heaven and form. The sign for lake, Tui, indicates calmness and is in a terminal state, belonging therefore to autumn. The sign for heaven, Qian, the creative and strong, is the realization of the yang principle that fecundates the receptive, Kun. The sign for water, Kan, the abyssal, contrasts with Kun. In its external structure, it represents the religion of Eros, while Li represents Logos, the sun, and Kan, the moon. The weddings at Kana Li are the secret magical process that begets the child, the new man. The sign for mountain, Zhen, stillness, is the image of meditation, which, by keeping the external still, produces the vitality of internalization. Therefore, Zhen is the place where death and life touch, where death is fulfilled and translated into the Tai Ying Hua Song. If one's consciousness is the celestial heart, Master Luthi said that what is by itself is called sense, for the sense has neither name nor figure. It is life, the primordial spirit. One cannot see essence and life. They are contained in the light of heaven. One cannot see the light of heaven. It is contained in both eyes. I shall be your companion and reveal to you first the secret of the golden flower of the Great One, in order to explain the rest in detail from there. The Great One is the designation of that which has nothing above itself. The secret of the magic of life consists in using action to reach non-action. One should not wish to leap over everything and penetrate directly. The transmitted maxim is to take into one's hands the work on essence. In doing so, what matters is not to fall into false paths. The golden flower is the light. What color is the light? The golden flower is taken as an allegory. This is the true power of the transcendent Great One. The phrase, "the lead of the region of water has only one taste," indicates in the Book of Changes that heaven engenders water through the One. This is precisely the true power of the Great One. If a man reaches that one, he is vivified. If he loses it, he dies. However, although man lives in the air, great novel air, just as fish live in water but do not see the water, man dies when he has no air of life, just as fish perish without water. Therefore, the adept has taught people to firmly hold the primordial and to preserve the One. That is the circular course of light and the preservation of the center. If this legitimate force is preserved, one can prolong one's lifespan and then apply the method to create an immortal body by fusing and mixing. The work of the circular course of light rests entirely on retrograde motion, concentrating thoughts instead of the celestial heart. The celestial heart lies between the sun and moon, that is, between both eyes. The Book of the Yellow Castle says, "In the field of 1 inch of the house of 1 foot, one can order life." The house of 1 foot is the face. In the face, the field of 1 inch could only be the celestial heart in the middle of the square inch. Love for magnificence in the purple hall of the city ceases to dwell, the god of emptiness and vitality extremes. The Confucianists call it the center of emptiness, the Buddhists the terrace of vitality, the Taoists the land of the ancestors, or the dark yellow castle, the gorge, or the space of the anterior sky. The celestial heart is equal to the dwelling. Light is the master of the dwelling. Therefore, as the light moves in a circular course, the forces of the integral body appear before its throne, just as when a holy king has taken the capital city and instituted the ordinance, all states approach with tribute gifts, or as when the Lord is tranquil and clear, servants and maids obey his mandates of their own accord, and each does his work. Therefore, you need only to place the light in circular motion. This is the highest and most marvelous secret. Light is easy to move but difficult to fix. If it is allowed to run in circles for long enough, it crystallizes. This is the natural spirit body. This crystallized spirit is formed beyond the 9 heavens. This is the state of which it is said in the Book of the Seal. Of the CEO, "Silent reason, you fly upward in the morning." In carrying out that maxim, you do not need to seek any other method, but simply concentrate your thoughts on it. The legendary book says that by concentrating thoughts, one can fly and will be born in heaven. Heaven is not the vast blue sky, but the place where corporeality is engendered in the house of the creative. If one continues in this for a long time, another body of spirit is born entirely naturally apart from the body. The golden flower is the elixir of life, Jungian, literally golden ball, golden pill. All mutations of spiritual consciousness depend on the heart. There is here a secret spell that, although it corresponds entirely exactly, is however so fluid that it requires extreme intelligence, clarity, and extreme absorption and tranquility. Without that extreme intelligence and maximum understanding, men cannot walk the path of applying the spell. Without that extreme immersion and tranquility, they cannot hold it firm. This section explains the origin of the great sense of the world. The celestial heart is the germinal root of the great sense. If one can be entirely tranquil, the celestial heart will manifest by itself. If the feeling is agitated and exteriorizes in direct form, man is born as a living primordial being. That living being remains from conception until birth in the true space. When the tone of individuality enters birth, essence and life are divided into 2 from that moment. If maximum tranquility is not achieved, essence and life will not see each other again. Therefore it is said in the plan of the Great Pole that the Great One encompasses in itself the true power, the seed, the spirit, the anime. If the anima's thoughts are entirely tranquil so that the celestial heart is seen, spiritual intelligence reaches the origin by itself. That essence dwells, of course, in the true space, but the brightness of the light dwells in both eyes. That is why the Master teaches the circular course of light to reach true essence. The primordial spirit is precisely essence and life, and when the real is accepted in it, it is precisely the primordial force, and the great sense is just that. The Master is concerned from here on because people do not mistake the path that leads from conscious action to unconscious non-action. Therefore, he says that the magic of the elixir of life serves conscious action to reach unconscious non-action. Conscious action consists of putting the light in circular motion through reflection, so that the release of heaven becomes manifest. If the true seed is born and the correct method is applied to fuse and mix it to create the elixir of life, then one passes through the gorge. The embryo is formed, which must be developed through the work of warming, nourishing, bathing, and washing. This passes into the field of the new unconscious action. A whole year of that period of fire is necessary before the embryo sheds the shell and passes from the common world to the saintly one. This method is entirely simple and easy, but there are so many mutating and changing states within it that it is said one cannot reach it suddenly with a leap. Those who seek eternal life must seek the place where essence and life originally emerge, the primordial spirit and the conscious spirit. Master Luthi said, "Confronted with heaven and earth, man is like an ephemeral creature, but confronted with the great sense, heaven and earth are also like a bubble and a shadow. Only the primordial spirit and true essence triumph in time and space. The force of the seed is thus, like heaven and earth, subject to perishability, but the primordial spirit is beyond polar differences. Here is the place from which heaven and earth derive their existence. If the apprentices understand how, in this way, the primordial spirit overcomes the polar oppositions of light and dark, they will not linger in the three worlds. However, only those who have looked at science in its original face are capable of this. When men are released from the maternal body, the primordial spirit dwells in the square inch between the eyes, but the conscious spirit dwells down in the heart. This lower carnal heart has the shape of a large peach. It is covered by the wings of the lungs, supported by the liver, and served by the intestines. This heart is dependent on the external world. If one does not eat for a day, one feels extremely uncomfortable. If it hears something frightening, it beats. If it hears something angry, it either becomes paralyzed or sad when faced with death. If it sees something beautiful, it becomes blinded. However, the celestial heart in the head would not have moved even the slightest. If it is questioned, it may not move. The celestial heart responds, "How could it move?" The true thought in the square inch does not move, for if it truly moves, it is not right. For when common men die, then it moves, but that is not right. The best is, of course, when the light has already been fortified in a spiritual body, and its vital force has gradually transcended the impulses and movements. But that is a secret that has not been revealed for thousands of years. The lower heart moves like a powerful general-in-chief who, due to his weakness, scorns the celestial sovereign and has taken control of state affairs. If they succeed in fortifying and preserving the primordial castle, it is like a vigorous and wise sovereign who sits on the throne. Both eyes put the light in a circular course, like two ministers on the right and left, who, with all their strength, support the sovereign. When everything is thus in order, all those rebellious heroes will appear with inverted spears to receive their mandates in the center of the universe. The path to the elixir of life recognizes as the highest magic the water seed, the fire of spirit, and the earth thought. What is the water seed? It is the true force of the previous heaven, Eros. The fire of spirit is indeed the light. The earth thought is indeed the celestial heart of the dwelling of the center. Intuition uses the fire of spirit to work the earth thought as substance and in the seed as foundation. Common men shape their bodies through thoughts. The body is not just the exterior body of 7 feet tall. Within the body dwells the anima. The anima clings to consciousness as its effect. Consciousness depends on the anima to be born. The anima is feminine. The substance of consciousness, as long as that consciousness is uninterrupted, begets again and again from generation to generation, and the variations of form and mutations of the substance of the anima are incessant. But besides that, there is the animes in which the spirit takes refuge. The animes dwells during the day in the eyes. During the night it resides in the liver. If it dwells in the eyes, it sees. If it resides in the liver, it dreams. Dreams are journeys of the spirit through all 9 heavens and all 9 lands. However, Upon awakening, it is gloomy and depressed, chained. The corporeal figure is chained by the anima. Therefore, through the circular course of light, the concentration of the anima is produced, and in this way, the spirit is protected, submitting the anima. In this way, the ancient method of escaping the world consisted precisely in perfectly refining the dross of darkness to return to pure creative essence. This is nothing more than diminishing the anima to complete the dan, and the circular course of light is the magical means for diminishing the dark and dominating the anima. Even if the work is not directed to lead back to the creative, but is limited to the magical means of the circular course of light, light is indeed what is creative. Through its circular course, the creative is returned. If that method is observed entirely by itself, the water seed will exist in abundance, the fire spirit will ignite, and the earth thought will fix and crystallize, and thus the holy fruit can be gestated. The beetle rolls its ball, and in the ball life is born as an effect of its indivisible work of spiritual concentration. Now, if an embryo can be born even in dung that sheds its shells, how could it not, if we concentrate the spirit on it, also engender a body? The dwelling of our celestial heart, the essence, is an effective and true logos in combination with vitality. When the dwelling of the creative descends, it divides into animes and animae. The animes that dwells in the celestial heart is of the nature of the luminous. It is the force of the light and pure. It is what we have received from the great void. It has a form from the primordial beginning. The anima is of the nature of the dark. It is the force of the heavy and murky. It is clinging to the corporeal fleshly heart. The animes loves life. The anima seeks death. All sensual pleasures and angry agitations are effects of the anima. It is the conscious spirit that after death feeds on blood, but during life it is in the greatest need. The dark returns to the dark, and things are attracted according to their kind. The apprentice, however, knows how to completely stretch the dark anima so that it transforms into pure light yang, as described in that section, the part they take in the formation of human life, the primordial spirit and the conscious spirit. The Master says the life of man is like that of an insect that lives only one day. Only the true essence of the primordial spirit can escape the circular course of heaven and earth and the fate of lions. The true essence emerges from the non-polar and receives the primordial force from the polar, thus embracing within itself the true essence of heaven and earth, and becomes conscious spirit. As a primordial spirit, it receives the essence of father and mother. This primordial spirit lacks consciousness and knowledge, but is capable of regulating the processes of body formation. The conscious spirit is very manifest and very effective, and is capable of adapting incessantly. It is the lord of the hearts of men as long as it remains in the body. It is the animes. After its separation from the body, it transforms into spirit, while the body comes into existence. The primordial spirit has not yet formed any embryo in which it could materialize, so it crystallizes in the free one, without poles. At the moment of birth, the conscious spirit inspires the force of the air and thus becomes the dwelling of the born. It dwells in the heart. From there on, it is lord of the heart, and the primordial spirit loses its place, while the conscious spirit holds the power. The primordial spirit loves rest. The conscious spirit loves movement. In its movements, it remains bound to feelings and desires. Day and night, it thus consumes the primordial seed until it has completely exhausted the force of the primordial spirit. Then the primordial spirit leaves the shell and departs. The force of the spirit of one who has generally done good is pure and clear. When death arrives, it exits through the upper openings, mouth and nose. The pure and light force of air rises and floats toward heaven and becomes the quintuple genius, present shadow, or spirit shadow. But when the primordial spirit was used by the conscious spirit during life for greed, madness, desire, and pleasure, and has committed all possible sins, then the force of the spirit is turbid and confused at the moment of death, and the conscious spirit exits along with the air through the door of the belly, through the lower openings. For if the force of the spirit is turbid and impure, it crystallizes downward, sinks into hell, and becomes a demon. Thus, not only does the primordial spirit lose its nature of true essence. Therefore, the Master says, if it moves, that is not right. If one wants to preserve the primordial spirit, it must first unconditionally submit to the spirit that discerns the path to submission. It leads precisely through the circular course of light. When the circular course of light is exercised, both body and heart must be forgotten. The heart must die, the spirit must live. When the spirit lives, breathing will miraculously begin to rotate. This is what the Master calls the best of all. For this, the spirit must be allowed to immerse in the lower belly, the solar plexus. Then, the force enters into relation with the spirit, and the spirit unites with the force and crystallizes. This is the method of how to get to work with time in the lodging of life. The primordial spirit transforms the true force at that moment. The method of turning the wheel of the mill must be applied so that it becomes the elixir of life. This is the method of work. When the pearl of the elixir of life is ready, the holy embryo can be formed. Then, the work must be directed towards the warming and nourishing of the spiritual embryo. This is the method of conclusion. If the body of the force of the child is completely formed, the work must be directed so that the embryo is born and returns to the void. This is the method of letting go. From the most remote times until today, these are not empty words, but the succession of the great meaning in the real method for producing an immortal spirit and a holy, eternally living man. But if the work has prospered up to this point, everything belonging to the dark principle is entirely consumed, and the body is born into pure light. If the conscious spirit has transformed into the primordial spirit, then it can only be said that it has reached the present sixfold genius of gold. If this method of the noble foundation is not applied as desired, then the path of birth and death is evaded. And circular course of light and preservation of the center. The Master Lusa asked, when was the expression circular course of light revealed? It was revealed by the true men at the beginning of form, Wang Jing, and when the light flows in a circle, all the forces of heaven and earth, of the luminous and the dark, crystallize. That is what is designated by germinal thought, by purification of force, or by purification of idea. When this magic begins to be applied, it is as if in the midst of being there is something that is not. Then, with time, the work ends, and beyond the body, there exists a body. It is as if, in the midst of it, the non-being had something that is. Only after a concentrated work of 100 days will the light be authentic. Only then does it become fire spirit. After 100 days, a point of the true pole of light, Yang, suddenly arises in the midst of the light, and then the pearl seed is born. It is like when a man and a woman unite and conception takes place. Then one must be completely calm to wait for it. The circular course of light is the time of fire. In the midst of primordial becoming is the brightness of light. What is decisive in the physical world is the sun. In man, it is the eye. The irradiation and dispersion of spiritual consciousness primarily begin when directed outward. It flows downward. Therefore, the meaning of the golden flower rests upon the retrograde method. The heart of man is under the sign of fire. The flame of fire pushes upward. When both eyes contemplate the things of the world, it is with vision directed outward. If now the eyes are closed and the gaze is reversed, directed inward, and contemplates the space of the ancestors, that is the retrograde method. The force of the kidneys is under the sign of water. When the urges stir, it flows downward, directed outward, and engenders children. If at the moment of liberation, it is not allowed to flow outward, but is led back through the power of thought, so that it pushes upward in the crucible of the creative, and refreshes and nourishes heart and body, that is likewise the retrograde method. Therefore, it is said that the meaning of the elixir of life completely rests on the retrograde method. The circular course of light is not only a circular course of the seed flower of the individual body, but is directly a circular course of the true formative creative force. It is not a momentary fantasy, but certainly the exhaustion of the circular course of the migration of the soul of all eons. Therefore, a breathing pause means 1 year according to man's time, and a breathing pause means 100 years measured by the long night of the 9 paths of reincarnations. Once a man has the tone of individuation behind him, he is born outward in correspondence with circumstances, and until old age, he does not look once in a retrograde way. The force of the luminous exhausts and drips. It leads to the world of the 9 darknesses of reincarnations. In the Book of Law in 10, it is said that through concentration of thoughts, one can fly. Through concentration of desires, one falls. When a disciple takes little care of thoughts and much care of desires, he reaches the path of perdition. Only through contemplation and rest does true intuition arise. For this, the retrograde method is needed. In the Book of Secret Correspondences, it is said that liberation is in the eye. In the Simple Questions of the Yellow Sovereign, it is said that the seed flower of the body of man must concentrate upward into the empty space. This relates to that. In that phrase, immortality is included, and also included is overcoming the world. This is the common goal of all religions. Light is not only in the body, it is also outside the body. Mountains and rivers and the great earth are illuminated by sun and moon. All this is that light. Therefore, it is not only in the body. Understanding and clarity, discernment and illumination, and all movements of the spirit are all equally this light. Therefore, it is not something outside the body. The flower of light of heaven and earth fills the thousand spaces, but also the flower of light of the individual body traverses heaven and covers the earth. Therefore, light is in circular motion. Simultaneously, heaven and earth, mountains and rivers are also in circular motion. Everything concentrates upward into the eye, the seed flower of the human body. This is the great key of the human body. Children, consider this. If you do not care, it is a day of meditation. This light flows outward. Who knows where? If you only take care of meditation for a quarter of an hour, you can thus end the 10,000,001 births. All methods lead to rest. You cannot elaborate with thought this marvelous magical means. But when one gets to work, one must advance from the manifest to the deep, from the vast to the fine. Everything depends on there being no interruption. The beginning and end of the work must be one. In between, there are colder and warmer moments, that is evident. But the goal must be to reach the breadth of heaven and the depth of the sea, that all methods appear completely easy and evident. Only then do you arrive at it. All saints have transmitted to each other that without contemplation, fantasy, or reflection, nothing is possible. When Kun says that knowing leads to the goal, he calls it the sight of the heart or side. It is said to see inward, all is the same. But everyone can speak of reflection, but they do not receive it in their hands if they do not know what the word means. What must be reversed through reflection is the self-conscious heart that must be directed to the point where the spirit of formation has not yet manifested within our 6-foot-high body. We must strive towards the figure that existed before the foundation of heaven and earth. If today's people sit and meditate only for 1 or 2 hours and only contemplate their own self and call that reflection or contemplation, how is something to come out of that? Both founders of Buddhism and Taoism have taught that one should look at the tip of the nose, but they did not imply that while the eye looks at the tip of the nose, thoughts must concentrate on the yellow center. Where the eye directs, the heart also directs. How can it be directed simultaneously upward to the yellow center and downward to the tip of the nose, or alternatively, now upward, now downward? All this is to confuse the moon with the finger that points to the moon. That is what the word tip of the nose is very cleverly chosen to convey. The nose should serve as a guiding line for the eye. If one does not follow the line of the nose, one opens the eyes widely and looks into the distance so that one does not see the nose, or the eyelids drop too much, causing the eyes to close, and thus the nose is also not seen. However, if one opens the eyes too widely, one commits the error of directing them outward, making one easily scatter. When the eyes are closed too much, one commits the error of turning them inward, easily falling into an absorbing daydream. Only when the eyelids are lowered to the correct mid-measure, comfortably over the tip of the nose, can they serve as a guiding line. It only matters that one lowers the eyelids correctly and allows the light to radiate inward by itself without tiring oneself in a concentrated attempt to bring the radiant light inside. Observing the tip of the nose serves only for the beginning of internal concentration, to bring the eyes to the correct direction of sight, and to keep them in line with the guiding line. Then one lets it be. It is the same as a mason suspending his plumb line. Once he has suspended it, he directs his work according to it without constantly worrying about looking at it. Fixed contemplation is a method in Buddhism that is in no way transmitted as a secret. Contemplate the tip of the nose with both eyes, sit upright and comfortably, and fix the heart at the center amidst conditions at the pole at rest in the flow of phenomena. In Taoism, this is called the yellow center. In Buddhism, the center amidst conditions both are the same. This does not necessarily mean the center of the head. It is simply a matter of fixing thought at the point that is exactly between both eyes. Then it is well. The light is something extremely mobile. If one fixes thought at the center between both eyes, the light radiates inward by itself. One does not need to direct special attention to the central castle. In these few words is contained the most important point. The center amidst conditions is a very fine expression. The center is omnipresent. Everything is in it, including it relates to the liberation of the entire process of creation. The condition, that is the portal of entry. The condition means that fulfilling this condition forms the principle, but does not bring the rest with it. With inexorable necessity, the significance of these two words is very fluid and fine. Fixed contemplation is indispensable. It produces the consolidation of illumination. Only one should not remain rigidly seated if worldly thoughts then appear, but one should investigate where this thought is, where it was born, where it extinguished. However, by pushing beyond the reflection, one does not reach the end. One must limit oneself to seeing where the thought was born, and must not search beyond the point of origin, because it is not possible to find the heart consciousness. Entering with consciousness behind consciousness, we want to bring all states of the heart to rest. That is, correct contemplation. Anything that contradicts this is false contemplation. It does not lead to any goal. If the flow of thoughts continues incessantly, increasingly interrupt it and enter contemplation. Contemplate, and then institute fixation again. This is the double culture of the consolidation of illumination. This means a circular course of light. The circular course is fixing the light, it is contemplation. Fixation without contemplation is a circular course without light. Contemplation without fixation is light without a circular course. The general sense of this section is that for the circular course of light, the preservation of the center is important. The last section dealt with the fact that the human body is a very valuable asset when the primordial spirit reigns. However, if it is utilized by the conscious spirit, it causes the primordial spirit to be scattered and wasted day and night. When the body is completely exhausted, it dies. Now, the method of subjugating the conscious spirit and protecting the primordial spirit is described, which is impossible if one does not start by circulating the light. It is as if one wants to build a splendid house. First, one must find a good foundation. Only when the foundation is solid can one go to work and found deeply and solidly the wall footings and erect the pillars and walls. If the foundation is not laid in this way, how can the construction of a house be completed? The method of caring for life is precisely this. The circular course of light should be compared to the foundation of the building. When the foundation is firm, how quickly can one build upon it? Preserve the yellow center with the fire of the spirit. This is the work of building. Therefore, the Master especially clarifies the method of how to enter into the care of life and orders people to look with both eyes at the tip of the nose, lower the eyelids, look inward, sit peacefully with the body upright, and fix the heart at the center amidst conditions. By fixing the thoughts in the intermediate space between both eyes, the light penetrates. Then the spirit crystallizes and enters the center amidst conditions. The center amidst conditions is the field of the lower elixir, the space of the solar plexus. The Master alludes to this secretly when he says, at the beginning of the work, one must sit in a quiet room that the body be like dry wood, that the heart be like cooled ashes, under the eyelids of both eyes, and look inward and purify the heart, wash the thinking, interrupt pleasures, and preserve the seed daily. Sit in meditation with crossed legs, stop the light of the eyes, crystallize the sound force of the ear, and reduce the gustatory force of the tongue. That is, the tongue should be placed against the palate. Make the breathing through the nose rhythmic, and fix the thoughts at the dark portal. If rhythmic breathing is not made first, it is to be feared that there will be respiratory difficulties due to blockage. When closing the eyes just right, direct them as a measure towards a point on the bridge of the nose that does not reach half an inch below the intersection point of the visual lines, where the nose has a small bump. Then one begins to concentrate thoughts. The ear makes the breathing rhythmic, and body and heart are in comfortable and harmonious styles. The light of the eyes must shine entirely, peacefully, and for a long time. Drowsiness or dispersion should not appear. The eye does not look outward. The eyelids are lowered. It shines inward, illuminating this place. The mouth does not speak or laugh. One closes the lips and breathes internally. The breath is in this place. The nose does not smell any odor. The sense of smell is in this place. The ear does not hear outward. The hearing is in this place. The whole heart watches the internal. Its watching is in this place. The thoughts do not run outward. The true thoughts endure by themselves. If thoughts are durable, the seed becomes durable. If the seed is durable, the force becomes durable. If the force is durable, the spirit becomes durable. The spirit is thought. Thought is the heart. The heart is fire. Fire is the elixir. If one considers this way, the wonders of opening and closing the portals of heaven become inexhaustible. But if the breath is not made rhythmic, the deepest secrets cannot be produced. When the apprentice begins and cannot fix his thoughts at the place between both eyes, when he closes his eyes but does not bring the force of the heart to the contemplation of the space of force, the most likely cause is that the breath is too loud and hurried, and from this, other evils arise because body and heart are constantly occupied in violently suppressing the upward force and the ardent breathing. If one only focuses the thoughts on both eyes, but does not crystallize the spirit in the solar plexus at the center of the conditions, it is as if one has ascended to the courtyard, but has not yet entered the inner chamber. Then the fire spirit will not be born, the force remains cold, and it will hardly manifest the true fruit. Therefore, the master will open the fear that men, in their efforts, only fix their thoughts on the space of the nose, but do not remember to focus their ideas on the space of the force. For this reason, he uses the allegory of the mason and the plumb line. The mason uses the plumb line only to see if a wall is vertical or inclined, with the string serving as a guideline. When he has determined the direction, he can begin his work, but he works on the wall, not on the plumb line. This is clear. It reduces to the fact that focusing thoughts between the eyes only has the meaning of the use of the plumb line by the mason. The master indicates this repeatedly because he fears that one might not understand his point of view, and when the apprentices have conceived how they should put their hands to work, he fears they might interrupt their work. Therefore, he says again that after a consistent period of 100 days, only the authentic light is real. Only then can the work with the fire spirit begin, when one proceeds concentratively. After 100 days, a point of the authentic creative light, Jung, is born. Apprentices must investigate it with sincere hearts. 4. Circular course of light and dignification of breath. Master Lu dies. You said that the resolution to not seek results must be fulfilled with all one's heart. The result comes by itself. In the first period of liberation, there are mainly two faults: laziness and distraction. However, this can be remedied. One must put the heart excessively into the breath. Breath comes from the heart. What comes out of the heart is breath. Thus the heart is excited, and breathing strength is born. Breathing strength is originally metamorphosed activity of the heart. When our ideas go very quickly, they unexpectedly turn into fantasies that are always accompanied by aspiration. For this internal and external breathing has cohesion like sound and echo. Daily we make countless aspirations and likewise have countless fantasies, and thus the clarity of the spirit drains away like wood drying up and ash dying. Consequently, one should have no ideas. One cannot be without ideas. One cannot breathe. One cannot be without breath. The best means is to make disease into medicine, since now heart and breath depend on each other. One must unite the circular course of light with making the breath rhythmic. For this, one first needs the light of hearing. There is a light of the eye and a light of the ear. The light of the eye is the united light of the sun and the moon from outside. The light of the ear is the united light of the sun and the moon from inside. The seed is, consequently, the light in crystallized form. Both have the same origin and differ only by name. Therefore, understanding through the ear and clarity through the eye are in common one and the same effective light. When sitting, one uses the eyes after lowering the eyelids to establish a line of conduct, and then one puts the light downwards behind. But the transposition downwards does not result. One directs the heart to hear the breath. One should not be able to hear the exit and entry of the breath. What one hears is just that there is no sound. If there is a sound, the breath is vast and superficial and does not penetrate freely. Therefore, the heart must be made entirely light and unimportant. The more loose it is left, the less important it becomes. The less important, the quieter it suddenly becomes, so much so that it ceases. Then, the breath enters into manifestation and the shape of the heart can become conscious. When the heart is fine, the breath is fine, for every movement of the heart produces breathing strength. When the breath is fine, the heart is fine, for every movement of the breathing strength works on the heart. To fix the heart, one must start by caring for the breathing strength. One cannot act directly, thus one takes the breathing strength as a handle. This is what is called preservation of concentrated breathing strength. Children you do not understand, for the essence of movement can generate movement through external means. It is only another name for domination. Thus, if one can simply make the heart move through running, one will also be able to make it still through concentrated repose. The great saints who have known how heart and breathing strength influence each other have imagined an easier procedure to serve posterity. In the Book of the Elixir it is said, "The hen can support her eggs because her heart always hears." This is an important magical formula. The reason the hen can incubate is the force of heat, but the force of heat can only warm the shells, not penetrate inside. Because of this, she directs this force inward with the heart. She does this through hearing. For this, she concentrates her whole heart. When the heart penetrates, the force penetrates, and the chick receives the force of heat and becomes alive. Thus the hen, even when she occasionally leaves her eggs, always has the gesture of hearing with an attentive ear. The concentration of the spirit does not experience any interruption because the concentration of the spirit does not experience any interruption. It does not suffer any interruption day and night. The force of heat and the spirit awakens to life. The awakening of the spirit occurs because, first of all, the heart has died. When man can allow his heart to die, then the primordial spirit awakens to life. Killing the heart does not mean its withering and desiccation, but that it has become indivisible and concentrated. The Buddha said, "If you fix your heart on a point, then nothing is impossible for you." The heart flees easily, so one must concentrate it through breathing strength. Breathing strength becomes vast easily, therefore one must refine it with the heart. If this is done, it may happen that it has not been fixed. Both faults, laziness and distraction, must be combated through restful work that is performed continuously every day without interruption. Then the result will surely present itself. When one does not sit in meditation, one will often be scattered without realizing it. Becoming aware of distraction is the mechanism that leads to the suppression of distraction. The laziness of which one is not aware and the laziness of which one is aware are miles apart. Unconscious laziness is really laziness. Conscious laziness is not full laziness, for there is still something of clarity in it. Distraction rests on the wandering of the spirit. Laziness rests on the spirit that is still not pure. Distraction is much easier to improve than laziness. It is like in an illness. When one feels pains and prickles, it can be cured with remedies. But laziness is like an illness that is combined with insensitivity. Distraction can be concentrated, confusion can be ordered, but laziness and absorption are obtuse and dark. Distraction and confusion still have at least one place, but in laziness and absorption only the soul manifests. In distraction, the soul is still present, but in laziness, only pure darkness reigns. When one becomes drowsy in meditation, that is an effect of laziness. For the suppression of laziness, only breath serves. Although the breath that enters and exits through the nose and mouth is not the true breath, it does result in combination with it, the entering and exiting of the true breath. While sitting, one must constantly keep the heart restful and concentrated on the strength. How can one achieve that the heart rests? Through the breathing of the outgoing and incoming breath, you must only be aware of the heart. One should not hear it with the ears. When one does not hear it, the breath is fine. If it is fine, it is pure. When one hears it, the respiratory force is vast. If it is vast, it is turbid. If it is turbid, laziness and absorption arise, and one tends to sleep. This is completely understandable. One must understand how to use the heart correctly in breathing. It is a use without use. It should only be allowed to fall entirely, which brings light to hearing. This phrase contains a secret meaning, which signifies letting light fall. It is the very radiating of the light of the eye. The eye looks only inward, not outward, experiencing lucidity without looking outward. That means looking inward. It is not a real looking inward. What does it mean to hear? It is the very hearing of the light of the ear. The ear listens only inwardly, without listening outwardly, feeling lucidity, without listening outwardly. That means listening inwardly. It is not a real listening inward. In this hearing, one hears only that there is no sound. In this seeing, one sees only that there is no figure. When the eye does not look outward and the ear does not listen outward, they close and are ready to turn inward. Only when one looks inward and listens inwardly does the organ not go outward, nor does it sink inward. This way, laziness and absorption are exposed. That is the combination of the following and the light of the sun and moon. When one, as a result of laziness, becomes lord of the wind, get up and walk around. When the spirit has become clear, sit down again. When one has time in the morning, one can sit during the burning of an incense stick. This is the best time. In the afternoon, human affairs disturb, and for that reason one easily falls into laziness. But one does not need to rely on an incense stick. One should simply set aside all entanglements and sit entirely calmly for a time. In time, one can achieve it without falling into laziness and dozing off. The main idea of this section expresses that the most important aspect of the circular course of light is to rhythmically engage the breath. The more progress made in the work, the deeper the teachings become. The apprentice must relate the heart and breathing to avoid the discomfort of laziness and distraction. The master fears that beginners, during the session, when they have just lowered their eyelids, may obtain confused fantasies as a result, causing the heart to start racing in a way that becomes difficult to direct. Therefore, he teaches the work of counting the breath and fixing the thoughts of the heart to prevent the spirit's force from flowing outward, because breathing comes from the heart. A rhythmic breathing comes from the heart's restlessness. Therefore, one must exhale and inhale very softly so that it remains inaudible to the ear, and only the heart counts the aspirations entirely quietly. When the heart forgets the number of aspirations, this is a sign that the heart has fled outward. Then the heart must remain firm. When the ear does not hear attentively, or the eyes do not look at the back of the nose, it also happens that the heart races outward or falls asleep. This is a sign that the state is becoming confusion and absorption. To put the spirit in order, when one lowers the eyelids and takes direction of the eyes and nose, one must not completely close the mouth and firmly clench the teeth. It also easily happens that the heart races outward. Therefore, one must quickly close and clench the teeth. The five senses are directed according to the heart, and the spirit must call on the respiratory force to enter into harmony with heart and breathing. This way, when more than a daily work of a few quarters of an hour enters into correct cooperation and harmony between heart and breathing, then there is no longer a need to count, and the breath becomes rhythmic on its own. When breathing goes rhythmically, laziness and distraction completely disappear over time by themselves. 5 errors in the circular course of light. Master Luthi said, "Your work will gradually become concentrated and mature, but before the state where one feels like a dry tree before the rock, there are still many possibilities for error that I would particularly like to draw attention to. These states are discerned only when experienced personally, so I will enumerate them here. My direction differs from the direction of Buddhist yoga in that it has its signs step by step. I would first like to discuss the errors and then speak about the signs of firmness and you. When one prepares to carry out their decision, they must first ensure that everything can take place in a comfortable, calm posture. One should not demand too much from the heart. Care must be taken that the strength and heart correspond to each other entirely automatically. Only then does one arrive at a state of rest. During the state of rest, one must care for the correct circumstances and the correct space. One should not sit amidst affairs. It is said that one should not have emptiness in the mind. All entanglements must be set aside. Be entirely sovereign and independent. One should also not direct thoughts toward correct execution. When one takes on too much work, this danger arises. I do not say that one should take no work, but the correct conduct is in the middle between being and not being. When one deliberately reaches the implementation, they have adapted it. One must remain sovereign and undisturbed independently. Additionally, one should not fall into the fascinating world. The fascinating world is where the 5 classes of dark monkeys play. This is, for example, the case when after fixation one mainly has thoughts of dry wood and dead ashes, and little thought of the bright spring over the great earth. This way one sinks into the world of darkness. The force there is cold, the breathing difficult, and many images of cold and what is extinguished are shown. When one delays for a long time, they enter into the realm of plants and stones. One should also not let oneself be led astray by the 10,000 entanglements. This occurs when, after starting the state of rest, all kinds of ties suddenly present themselves continuously. One wants to pierce through them, but cannot, and feels relieved by it. This means the Lord becomes a servant. When one delays for a long time, they enter into the world of illusory desires, and at best, they are thrown into the sky. At worst, into the spirits of torment. It can also manifest in celebrated mountain chains, enjoying the wind and moon, flowers and fruits, finding joy in coral trees and herbs of jewels. But after manifesting in this way for 300 to 500 years, or at most after a few thousand years, their reward is finished and they are born again into the world of unrest. All of this is a wrong path. When one knows the wrong path, then one can inquire about the signs of firmness. The meaning of this section is to draw attention to the wrong paths in meditation, so that one reaches the space of force and not the cavern of fantasy. This is the world of demons. Such is the case, for example, when one sinks into meditation and flames of light or colorful colors appear, or when one sees bodhisattvas or gods approaching, or other similar fantasies, or when one cannot bring together force and breathing completely, when the water of the kidneys cannot rise but pushes downward, the primordial force becomes cold and breathing difficult. Then the gentle forces of light from the great earth are too few, and one falls into the empty world of fantasy. Or when, in a long session, the ideas surge up in a crowd. One wants to contain them, but if one cannot, they let themselves be carried away by them and feel lighter. One should not, under any circumstances, continue with meditation, but should get up and walk around for a while until strength and heart are in unison again. Only then can one resume meditating. When meditating, one must have a special kind of intuition to feel the union of force and breathing in the elixir field, which begins to stir with a warm release belonging to the true light. Then the correct space has been found. When this correct space is found, one is free from the danger of falling into the world of illusory desires or dark demons. Experiences with firmness. During the circular course of light, Master Luthi said, "There are many kinds of experiences with firmness. One should not content themselves with limited pretensions, but rise to the thought that every living being must be redeemed. One should not have a light and negligent heart, but strive for the word to be demonstrated through deeds. When during repose the spirit has an uninterrupted duration of a great joy, as if one were drunk or just bathed, this is a sign that the luminous principle is harmonious in the whole body. There begins to emerge the golden flower. When later on all the openings are still, and the silver moon is in the middle of the sky, and one has the feeling that this great earth is a world of light and clarity, this is a sign that the heart's body opens to clarity. This is a sign that the golden flower opens. Moreover, one feels the whole body firm and strong so that one does not fear storms or frost. Things that other men consider not at all joyful cannot disturb the clarity of the spirit. When I stumble upon them, yellow gold fills the house. White jade forms the steps. The corrupt and stinking things on the earth that come into contact with a breath of true strength immediately become alive again. The red blood turns to milk. The fragile carnal body is vein gold and precious stone. This is a sign that the golden flower crystallizes. The book of successful contemplation, Yingwang Jing, says, "The sun sinks into the great water, and magical images of trees in rows arise." The sunset of the sun signifies that the foundation is exposed in chaos, the world before manifestation, the intelligible world. This is the state free of poles. The supreme good is like pure and unblemished water. This is the Lord of great polarity, the God who advances in the sign of commotion. In the commotion the image is wood, therefore the image of rows of trees is born. A sevenfold row of trees signifies the light of the seven openings of the body or openings of the heart. In the northwest is the direction of the creative. When one moves a place further, there is the abyss. The sun sinking into the great water is the image of the creative and the abyssal. The abyssal is the direction of midnight. For the winter solstice, the thunder Dushen is entirely concealed and covered in the middle of the earth. Only when the sign of commotion is reached does it advance again over the earth, the pole of light. This is the image of rows of trees. The rest is allowed to be revealed correspondingly. The second section means to erect the foundation. Thus, the great world is like ice, a world of glass or jewels. The brightness of the light crystallizes gradually. Therefore, a high terrace is born, and on it appears over time the Buddha. When the being of gold appears, who could be other than the Buddha? For the Buddha is the saint of gold of great illumination. This is a great experience. There are now 3 experiences with Fermat and base that one can test. The first is that when one has entered the state of meditation, the gods are in the valley. One hears men speaking as if from a distance of a few hundred steps, each one clearly and individually. But the voices all sound like an echo in a valley. One always hears them, but one never hears oneself. This is called the presence of the gods in the valley. At times one can experience the following. As one is in repose, the light of the eyes begins to rise in flames, so that everything before one becomes entirely lucid, as if one were in a cloud. If one opens the eyes and seeks their body, one no longer finds it. This is called in the empty chamber. Lucidity is made, everything inside and outside is equally lucid. This is a very favorable sign. Or when one sits to meditate, the carnal body becomes entirely bright, like silk or jade. Sitting becomes difficult. One feels drawn upward. This means the spirit returns and presses against the sky. With time, one can experience that one really floats upward. Now one can make these 3 experiences, but one cannot express all of them in correspondence with the talents of different men. Different things appear to each one when one experiences them. The things just mentioned are a sign of a good disposition. With these things, it is like when one drinks water. One observes whether the water is warm or cold, and in the same way, one must convince oneself of such experiences. Only then are they real. The living way of the circular course of light. Master Luthi said, when one gradually manages to set the circular course of light in motion, one must not renounce one's ordinary vocation. The ancients said, when affairs come to us, we must accept them. When things come to us, we must discern them to the bottom. When one puts affairs in order through correct thoughts, the light is not scattered by external things, but rather turns according to its own law. In this way, one can execute even the still invisible circular course of light, much more so if it is the authentic, true circular course of light that has already manifested clearly. When one is continually in ordinary life, in a state of reacting to things only by reflections, without any interference from a thought about the others, or about whether this is a circular course of light resulting from circumstances, this is the first secret. When in the morning, one can free oneself from all complication and meditate for 12 double hours, then one can orient oneself in all occupations and in front of all external things with a purely objective reflex method. When this is continued without interruption, after 2 or 3 months, all the consummate ones come from heaven and sanctify such conduct. The preceding section deals with the typical fields one enters when one advances in work. This section aims to show the apprentices how they should refine their work daily, so that they can expect a prompt attainment of the elixir of life. As it happens that the Master speaks precisely now about not renouncing civil profession, one could think that the Master wants to prevent the apprentice from quickly obtaining the elixir of life. Who knows? To reply to this, not at all. The Master is anxious because the apprentice has not yet fulfilled his karma. For this reason he speaks like this. When the work has already led to the verifying fields, the heart is like a mirror of water. When things come, it reflects things. When things leave, spirit and strength unite again by themselves and are not distracted by external things. This is what the Master implies when he says one must completely renounce all interference of thought in others and in oneself. When the apprentice succeeds in fully fixing himself to the space of strength through true thought, he does not need to set the light in circulation, and the light turns by itself. But when the light turns, the elixir is generated by itself, and nothing obstructs one from simultaneously carrying out worldly works. It is indeed different at the beginning of meditation, when spirit and strength are still dispersed and confused. When one cannot then keep worldly affairs at a distance and cannot find a quiet place where to concentrate with complete strength, thus avoiding all disturbances due to ordinary occupation, perhaps one is diligent in the morning and certainly lazy by evening. How long must this continue until one penetrates the real secrets? Therefore, it is said that when one begins to dedicate oneself to work, all domestic affairs should be rejected, and when that does not fully succeed, one should charge someone to take care of them. Thus, one can devote oneself to the work with full attention, but when the work has advanced in such a way that one experiences secret confirmations, it does not matter if one simultaneously puts ordinary affairs in order to thus fulfill his karma. This is called the living way of the circular course of light. In other times, the true man of the purple polar light said, "Yes, young Shung," in one phrase. When one takes care of their conduct, they mix with the world and yet, at the same time, with the light. Then the round is round and the angles are angles. Thus one lives among men, mysteriously manifest, distinct yet equal, and no one can probe it. Then, no one notices our secret conduct. The living way of the circular course of light indeed has the meaning of living in a mixture with the world, while simultaneously aligning with the light. 8 Magic Formula for the Journey to Distant Lands. Master Luthi said, "You have left behind a magic formula for the journey to distant lands." 4 words crystallize in the spirit. In the space of force, in the 6th month, suddenly one sees white snow flying to the 3rd watch. One sees the sun's disk radiating blindingly in the water. The wind of kindness blows, wandering through the sky, consuming the strength of the receptive spirit and the even deeper secret of secrets, the land that is nowhere. This is the true homeland. Those verses are very mysterious. The significance is the most important. In the grand sense, they are words in it. Not acting. The acting of not taking allows one to be entangled in form and image, corporeality. Acting in the not acting prevents one from sinking into the void and the dead nothingness. The effect rests entirely on the one central. The release of the effect is found in both eyes. Both eyes are like the spear of the great carriage that makes the whole creation spin. They set in motion the poles of the luminous and the dark. The elixir rests in principle and end upon the one, the metal in the midst of water. This is lead in place of water. Until now we have spoken of the circular course of light, indicating the initial liberation that acts from the outside on the inside. This is to assist in receiving the Lord. This is for the apprentices in the initial steps. They cultivate the 2 lower transitions to gain the upper transition. Once the sequence becomes clear and the way of liberation is known, heaven no longer spares the meaning, but reveals the axiom among all that is supreme. You, disciples, keep it secret and vigorously apply the circulation of light. It is the total designation. The further the work advances, the more the golden flower comes to bloom. Now someone has a luckier and more prodigious course of circular light. Until now, we have acted from the outside on the inside. Now we remain at the center and dominate the external. Until now, it was a service to help the Lord. Now it is a propagation of the mandates of this Lord. The entire relationship reverses now. When one wants to penetrate the method into the finest fields, one must first ensure that one completely masters body and heart, that one is entirely free and at rest. Let go of all entanglements, have no more agitation, and let the celestial heart remain exactly in the center. Then lower the eyelids of both eyes, as if one receives a holy edict calling one to the minister. Who would dare not obey it? Then both eyes illuminate the house of the abyssal water, Khan. There appears the golden flower to meet it. The true light flies. The adherent, the luminous, is bright outside and dark inside. This is the body of the creative. The dark enters and becomes the Lord. The consequence is that the heart consciousness becomes dependent on things. It is directed outward and gets pushed back and forth by the current. When now the circulating light shines inward, it does not become dependent on things, and the force of the dark is limited, and the golden flower illuminates concentrically. This is then the concentrated solar light. The related attracts in this way. The luminous polar line of the abyss pushes upwards. This is not only the luminous in the abyss, but it is creative light that meets creative light. As soon as these 2 substances meet, they combine indissolubly, and an incessant life is born. It comes and goes, rises and falls of itself in the house of primordial force. Lucidity and infinitude are felt. The whole body feels light, and one would like to fly. This is the state of which it is said, "The clouds fill the 1,000 mountains." Gradually, it goes here, and it entirely remains. It rises and falls imperceptibly. The pulse stops and the breath ceases. This is the moment of true generative union, the state of which it is said, "The moon concentrates the 10,000 waters." In the midst of this darkness, a movement suddenly begins, the celestial heart. This is the return of light, a time when the child comes to life. But the details of this must be explained completely. When a man observes something, hears something, his eyes and ears move and follow things until they have departed. These movements are subjects of everything, and when the celestial sovereign follows them in their tasks, they mean living with demons. Now when one lives with men, not with demons, in every movement, in every stillness, the celestial sovereign is the true man. When he moves and one moves alongside him, then the movement is the root of heaven. When he is still and one is still alongside him, then stillness is the cave of the moon. When he continues ceaselessly with movement and stillness, one must follow together with him unceasingly with movement and repose. When he ascends and descends in inspiration and expiration, ascend and descend together with him in inspiration and expiration. This is what is called going and coming between the root of heaven and the cave of the moon. When the celestial heart still maintains tranquility, the movement before the correct time is a fault of softness. When the celestial heart has already moved, the movement that follows behind to correspond is a fault of rigidity. Thus, when the celestial heart stirs, one must immediately, with complete willingness, rise towards the house of the creative. Thus, the spirit's light sees the peak, which is the conductor. This movement corresponds to time. The heart of heaven rises to the peak of the creative. There it extends in full freedom. Then it suddenly desires profound stillness, and one must introduce it without delay, with complete willingness, into the yellow castle. Thus, the light of the eye sees the yellow central dwelling of the spirit. When then desires for stillness arrive, not a single thought arises. He who looks inward suddenly forgets that he is looking. For that time, body and heart must be left completely free. All entanglements have disappeared without a trace. Then I no longer know in which place my house of spirit and crucible is. If one wants to ensure their body, they cannot achieve it. This state is the penetrating of heaven into the earth, the time when all wonders return to their root. This occurs when the crystallized spirit enters the space of force. The one is the circular course of light. When one begins, at first, it is still scattered, and one wants to concentrate it. The six senses are not active. This is the care and nourishment of one's own origin. Filling to the edges the oil when one goes to receive life. When then one is as far away as to have concentrated it, one feels light and free and no longer has the need to undertake the slightest work. This is the calming of the spirit in the space of the ancestors, taking possession of the earlier heaven. When then one is as far away as for each shadow and each echo to be extinguished, so that one is entirely still and firm, this is the safeguarding of the cave of strength, where all that is wondrous returns to the root. One does not change the place, but the place divides. This is the incorporeal space. There are 1,000 places and 10,000 places are one place. One does not change time, but time divides. This is the immeasurable time. All lions are like an instant, as long as the heart has not reached the supreme repose. One cannot move. One moves the movement and forgets the movement. This is not movement in itself, therefore it is said that if one, excited by external things, moves, this is the urge of being. If one moves, not excited by external things, this is the movement of heaven. The being confronted by heaven can fall and slide under the dominion of urges. The urges are based on the existence of external things. They are thoughts that surpass their own situation. Then, movement leads to movement. But when no idea arises, the correct ideas are born. That is the true idea. When things are at rest, when one is completely firm, the release of heaven moves suddenly. This is not a purposeless movement. The action in non-action has precisely that meaning. Regarding the beginning of poetry, the first two lines entirely refer to the activity of the golden flower. The next two lines deal with the reciprocal conversion of the sun and moon into one another. The sixth month is the adherence. The fire, the white snow that flies, is the true dark polar amidst the sign of fire that is about to overturn into the receptive. The third guard is the abyss with water. The solar disk is the polar line, one in the sign of water, which is about to overturn into the creative. There lies the way in which the sign of the abyss is taken, and the way in which the sign of adherence is reversed. The next two lines deal with the manifestation of the sphere of the great vehicle, ascending and descending from the integral polar release. The water is the sign of the abyss, the eye is the wind of the gentle. The light of the eye illuminates in the house of Lobimali. There rules the seed of the great light in heaven, which means the house of the creative, who, peregrinating, consumes the force of the spirit of the receptive. This shows how the spirit penetrates into the force, as heaven penetrates into the earth. This happens to nourish the fire. The last two lines finally indicate the deepest mystery from which one cannot deprive oneself. From beginning to end, it is the washing of the heart and the purification of thoughts. It is the bath. Holy science begins with the knowledge of where to stop, and its termination is the stopping in the supreme good. Its beginning is beyond polarity and also culminates beyond it. The Buddha spoke of the ephemeral, creator of consciousness, as the fundamental principle of religion. In our Taoism, the integral work to consummate essence and lives is included in the expression of producing the void. All three religions agree on the proposition: find the spiritual elixir to pass from death to life. What does this spiritual elixir consist of? It means remaining always in the purposeless. The profound secret of the bath, which is the deepest of our teaching, is thus limited to the work of making the heart empty. With this, the heart is calmed. What I have revealed here in one word is the fruit of arduous labor. If you are not yet clear about the extent to which the three sections can all be present in one section, I shall clarify it for you through the Buddhist triple concentration on emptiness, illusion, and center. Among the three contemplations, the first comes as emptiness. All things are observed as empty. Then follows illusion. Although it is known that they are empty, one does not destroy things but continues one's affairs amidst the emptiness. However, while not destroying things, one does not pay attention to them. This is the contemplation of the center. While practicing the contemplation of emptiness, one also knows that one cannot destroy the myriad things. Nevertheless, one does not take them into account. In this way, the three contemplations coincide. But finally, the strength rests in the contemplation of emptiness. Therefore, when one practices the contemplation of emptiness, emptiness is surely empty. But also, illusion is empty, and the central is empty. Great strength is needed to practice the contemplation of illusion. Then illusion is truly illusion, but also emptiness is illusion, and the center is also illusion. On the path of the center, one also engenders images of emptiness, but does not call them empty. Rather, one calls them central. One also practices the contemplation of illusion, but does not call it illusion. Instead, one calls it central. As for the center, there is no need to speak further. This section mentions, first of all, the magic formula of using for the journey to the distance. Such a formula states that the mysterious miracle of meaning consists in how something is born from nothing, while the spirit and force unite in crystallized form. Over time, amidst the void of nothingness, a point of true fire is formed. At this time, the fire will become ever more lucid the more at rest the spirit is. The lucidity of the fire is compared to the heat of the sun of the 6th month. While the flaming fire evaporates the water of the abyss, the steam from the water, when it surpasses the boiling point, ascends to the heights like flying snow. This is understood with the seeing of snow flying in the 6th month. But because the water is evaporated by the fire, the true force stirs, for when the dark is calm, the lucid moves. This is akin to the state of the living midnight. At that time, one acts upon the force with the intention that it ascends retrogressively and descends directly, just as the solar wheel turns upward. Therefore, it is said, at the 3rd guard, the solar disk is seen radiating dazzlingly. The method of rotation uses the breath to encourage the fire of the portal of life, thereby achieving that the true force returns to its original place. Hence, it is stated that the wind blows in the water of the force. From the previous heaven, the incoming and outgoing breath of the posterior heaven develops, and its force must stoke the path that leads from the sacrum upward in a retrogressive manner to the peak of the creative and through the house of the creative. Then it goes down through both floors directly to the solar plexus and warms it. Therefore, it is said, peregrinating in heaven, one consumes the force of the spirit of the receptive. While the true force returns to the empty place, Over time they become abundant and full. Body and heart become joyful and serene. If it is not achieved through the work of turning the wheel of teaching, how else could this journey to the distance be undertaken? What matters is that the crystallized spirit reverberates over the fire of the spirit, and through extreme rest you see the fire in the middle of the water that lies in the midst of the empty cave. Therefore it is said, "And the deepest secret of the secret, the land that is nowhere." This is the true homeland. Now in his work the apprentice has already entered the mysterious fields, but if he does not know the method of refining this, he may find it difficult to produce the elixir of life. Therefore the Master has revealed the secret, which has been severely preserved by the previous saints. When the apprentice lets the crystallized spirit adhere in the middle of the cave of force, and at the same time allows extreme tranquility to reign, something is born from the dark abyss, that is to say, the golden flower of the Great One appears. At this time, the conscious light is differentiated from the essence light. Therefore, it is said that moving excitedly by external things leads to going directly outward and engenders a man. This is the conscious light. If the apprentice, for the time he has abundantly concentrated true force, does not let it flow directly outward, but rather makes it turn retrograde, this is the light of life. The method of turning the millstone must be applied. When the true force is turned durably, it returns drop by drop to the root. Then the millstone stops, the body is pure and the force is fresh. A single rotation signifies a cycle of heaven, which the Master calls a small cycle of heaven. One does not wait until the force has sufficiently concentrated to use it. Otherwise it is still very weak and tender, and the elixir does not form. When the force exists and is not used, it becomes too old and rigid, and it is hardly produced as the elixir of life. When it is neither too old nor too tender, then it is the right moment to be able to use it. This is what the Buddha implies when he says that manifestation leads to the void. That is the sublimation of the seed into force. If the apprentice does not understand this principle and lets it escape directly, then the force transforms into seed. This is what it means that the void leads to manifestation. For every man who unites physically with a woman first feels pleasure and then bitterness. When the seed has drained, the body is tired, and the spirit has been voted out. Very different is when the adept uses an art. Spirit and force give first purity and then freshness. When the seed has metamorphosed, the body is healthy and free. Tradition recounts that the ancient master Pont had reached 880 years, having used serving maidens to nourish his life. Of course, this is a misunderstanding. He actually used the method of sublimation of spirit and force in the elixirs of life. Now, symbols are mostly used, and often in them, the fire of the adherent is compared to the bride, and the water of the abyss with the child outside the eternal. Hence arises the misunderstanding that Master Pont restored his virility through the feminine. These are errors introduced later, but the adepts can use the method of overthrowing the abyss and the adherent only when they sincerely place their intentions into the work. Otherwise, the mixture does not occur pure. The true intention is subjected to the earth. The color of the earth is yellow. Therefore, it is symbolized in the books of the elixir of life with the yellow germ. By combining the abyss and the adherent, the golden flower appears. The color of gold is white. Therefore, white snow is used as a symbol. But the people of the world who do not understand the secret words of the books of the elixir of life have made a mistake taking yellow and white as a method to make gold from stones. Isn't that foolish? An ancient adept said, "Previously, every school knew this jewel. Only the fools did not fully understand it." If one reflects on this, it becomes clear that in reality, the ancients, with the help of the seed force existing in their own bodies, achieved long life, not that they extended their years by ingesting any elixir. But the people of the world lost the root and took the tops. The Book of the Elixir also states that when a correct man, a white magician, uses the wrong means operate correctly. With this, the metamorphosis of the seed into force is understood. But when a wrong man uses the correct means operate incorrectly. With this, the physical union of man and woman from which children arise is understood. The fool dissipates the highest jewel of his body in untamed pleasure and does not know how to preserve his seed force. The existing seed in their own bodies achieves long life. the saints and wise, have no other way to care for their life than to annihilate pleasures and preserve the seed. The concentrated seed is transformed into force, and the force, when sufficient in abundance, creates the strong creative body. The difference with common men rests only in the application of the direct or retrograde path. The integral meaning of this section is directed to clarify to the apprentice the method of filling the oil to the brim when encountering life. The main things for this are both eyes. Both eyes are the handle of the polar star. Just as the sky revolves around the polar star as its center, so must the correct intention reign in man. Therefore, the consummation of the elixir of life rests entirely upon the harmonization of the correct intention. If it is said that in 100 days one can establish the foundations, it must first take into consideration the degree of application to work and the strength of the bodily constitution. Whoever is ardent in their work and has a strong constitution achieves faster the turning of the millstone of the posterior river. Whoever then finds the method to affirm harmoniously in succession thoughts and force can already consummate the elixir within 100 days, but whoever is weak and lazy produces nothing even after 100 days. When the elixir is consummated, spirit and force are pure and clear, the heart is empty, essence manifests, and the light of consciousness transforms into the light of essence. When the light of essence is maintained firm and durably, the abyss and the adherent relate to each other by themselves. When the abyss and the adherent are mixed, the holy fruit is gestated. The ripening of the holy fruit is the effect of a great cycle of heaven. Further explanations stop at the method of the cycle of heaven. This book deals with the means of caring for life and shows, first of all, how to get to work by looking at the back of the nose. Here only the method of change is exposed. The methods for consolidation and release are in another work, The Sum Infant, the method of continuing life.